I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was a chance to escape everything: work, the daily grind, and the usual distractions of city life. A weekend in the wilds of the United Kingdom, alone, in a quiet corner of the countryside. I'd spent a lot of time researching the perfect spot, somewhere remote, where I could pitch my tent, build a fire, and just enjoy the simplicity of nature. I was 30 years old, fairly experienced with camping, but I wasn't one to take unnecessary risks. I had all the right gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, plenty of food, and I was excited to disconnect. The campsite was in a secluded part of the Lake District, not far from Keswick, where few people ventured. I had made sure of that by picking a spot deep in the woods, a place most tourists would overlook. It seemed perfect, peaceful, quiet, isolated. The weather was crisp when I arrived, a cool breeze cutting through the trees, but nothing that would ruin the weekend. I parked my car in the small, gravel parking area just outside the woods and loaded up my backpack. It was a short walk to the campsite, about a mile or so through the trees. As I made my way into the woods, I noticed how still everything was. No birds singing, no rustling in the leaves, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the ground. By the time I reached the clearing, it was getting late, but there was still enough daylight to set up camp. I picked a flat spot next to a small stream, the sound of water flowing quietly in the background. The trees around me were thick and tall, their branches creating a canopy overhead, blocking out much of the sky. It was the kind of place that felt almost too perfect, like it had been waiting just for me. Setting up the tent didn't take long. I unrolled my sleeping bag and set up my stove, boiling some water for tea. The air was cooling off now, and I started a small fire in the fire pit I'd built, making sure to keep it under control. I sat there for a while, sipping my tea, watching the flames dance. There was something peaceful about it, but also something strange in the air. It was like the silence around me was a little too thick, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I shook it off. It was probably just the isolation. As darkness settled in, I went into the tent to get some rest. The fire outside crackled, and I could still hear the gentle stream gurgling in the background. I had left the tent flap slightly open to let in some air, but when I lay down, I noticed the temperature had dropped quickly. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come as easily as I'd hoped. My mind was restless, and I kept hearing sounds. Footsteps in the leaves, a branch snapping. Every time I perked up, there was nothing, just the wind, or maybe the wild animals I'd read about: foxes, deer, badgers. Nothing to worry about. At around midnight, I heard it, a rustling sound right outside my tent. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too close. My heart started to pound. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for any other sound. The rustling came again, followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow and measured. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I lay there trying to make sense of it. My first instinct was to call out, but I didn't want to sound foolish. There was no reason to panic, right? Probably just a curious animal. But then I heard a voice, a low, gravelly voice, too faint to make out the words, but close enough that I could feel it on the back of my neck. Panic started to build in my chest. I had a knife with me, but the thought of using it on a person felt ridiculous. What would a person be doing out here in the middle of the night? I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it through the mesh of the tent. Nothing. The beam flicked across the dark woods, the shadows playing tricks on me. No movement, but the feeling didn't go away. I waited for what felt like hours, the tension in my chest making it hard to breathe. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, or maybe a badger rooting around for food. I slowly drifted back to sleep, keeping the flashlight on the ground beside me. The next morning, I woke to a cold mist hanging over the campsite. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and everything was damp with dew. I rubbed my eyes and stepped out of the tent, hoping that the light of day would put my restless night into perspective. But when I looked around, I noticed something odd. The area where I had set up my camp, the place where I'd left my backpack and gear, looked disturbed. The ground was slightly shifted, as if someone had been walking around it. I crouched down to examine it, and that's when I saw the footprints. They weren't animal prints, at least not any I recognized. They were too large, too human, but they didn't make sense. The toes were too spread out, the tread uneven, and there were more of them, leading away from the tent and deeper into the woods. My stomach dropped. I thought about leaving, packing up, and heading back to the car, but the drive back would be hours. And besides, if I left now, it would feel like I was running away. But something in my gut told me to leave. That unease, that lingering feeling that something wasn't right, wouldn't go away. Instead of packing up and heading straight to the car, I decided to follow the tracks. I needed to know who or what had been out there. So, I grabbed my pack, threw on my boots, and headed off into the woods. The tracks led me deeper, to an area I hadn't seen before. The trees were denser here, and the mist made everything seem otherworldly. The air was thick and damp. I walked for what felt like miles, the tracks winding through the underbrush, until I came across something strange. A small, abandoned cabin. The wooden structure was dilapidated, the roof caving in, windows shattered. It looked like it had been untouched for years. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up again. There were no signs of recent life, but something about the cabin made me uneasy. I stepped closer, peering through the broken window. Inside, it was empty, except for what looked like a pile of old blankets in the corner. I was about to turn away when I noticed something on the floor near the door. A boot. Not just any boot, one that looked identical to the one I had seen in the footprints. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around and tried to make my way back to the campsite, but the further I walked, the more the unease grew. It wasn't just the sight of the cabin that bothered me now. It was the feeling that I was being watched, the unmistakable sense that I wasn't alone. When I got back to my campsite, the place felt different, felt violated. I couldn't explain it, but it was like everything had changed in the few hours I'd been gone. The fire pit, which I had doused before I left, was now smoldering again, and in the ash, there were fresh footprints. I didn't waste any time. I packed up everything, threw it all in my car, and drove off without looking back. The road felt longer on the way back, the woods on either side closing in. I kept expecting someone to appear in the rearview mirror or to hear footsteps behind me, but nothing happened. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was setting, and the tension finally began to ease. I don't know who or what had been out there, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that I've never been back to that part of the Lake District. The woods hold too many secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. It was late September, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip in the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains. The air was cool but not yet cold, just the perfect temperature for a weekend away from the noise of the city. I had been feeling run down and needed time to recharge, so the plan was simple. Pitch a tent, cook some meals over a fire, and enjoy the silence. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and the wilderness. I'd been to these woods before, years ago, with friends. It had always been a place of peace, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets at night. This time, I was going alone. I thought it would be therapeutic, a way to reflect on things in my life that I hadn't had time to process. I was in my late 20s, a little burned out from the constant grind of work, and I figured this would be a good way to disconnect. The trail I hiked in on was quiet, and I only passed a couple of other campers who were setting up near a distant lake. They waved, but I was in no mood for conversation. I kept to myself, heading deeper into the woods, past the lake, and toward a small clearing I had found on an old map. It wasn't a marked campsite, which was perfect. It meant I wouldn't have to share the space with anyone. By the time I reached the clearing and set up my tent, it was already late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the tall pines, casting long shadows over the ground. I was exhausted from the hike, so I set up camp quickly, unpacked my gear, and started a fire. The smoke twisted lazily in the breeze, and the warmth felt good against the cool evening air. After some time, the sun finally disappeared, and the forest was plunged into a deep, heavy darkness. I had packed a small dinner, nothing fancy, and sat near the fire eating quietly, enjoying the solitude. I'd seen some wildlife on my hike in, a few deer, a couple of squirrels, but other than that, the forest felt still, almost unnervingly so. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only one there. That's when I first heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I had imagined it. A soft rustling sound coming from the edge of the forest. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals don't rustle that way. It was the sound of something or someone moving carefully through the underbrush. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe even a bear. I was alone and I was used to the wilderness after all. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate, like something was circling my camp. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, scanning the treeline, my heart pounding now. The beam of light swept over the dark shapes of trees and brush, but there was nothing, just the shadows playing tricks in the forest. I sat back down, trying to calm myself, but the rustling wouldn't stop. It was getting closer now. My mind raced, thinking about what could be out there. Maybe another camper, someone trying to sneak up on me? I told myself that was all it was. But the longer I listened, the more the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It didn't feel right. I stood up again, this time moving cautiously toward the edge of the camp where the sound was coming from. I shone the flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing, no movement, no eyes glinting in the light, just the endless shadows of trees. That's when I saw her. First, I thought I was imagining it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. It was a woman. Her face was pale, almost ghostly under the dim light, and her hair hung in tangled knots around her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. I froze. My breath caught in my chest as the realization hit me. She hadn't been making the noise, but she had been out there, watching me for who knows how long. I couldn't see her eyes, not clearly, but I knew she was looking directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, something primal in the pit of my stomach telling me that I was not safe. Without thinking, I turned and grabbed my phone from the tent. The screen was almost dead, but there was just enough power left to make a call. My hands were shaking as I tried dialing, but the signal was weak, nothing but static. I turned back toward where the woman had been, but she was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the dark woods. There was no sign of her, no movement, nothing. Just the distant whisper of the wind and the soft crackle of the fire. I stayed up for hours, the fire burning low, my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, lurking just beyond the light, waiting for something. The whole night felt wrong. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind had me jumping at shadows. But eventually, exhaustion won out. I huddled in my sleeping bag, hoping that sleep would bring relief, but it didn't. My dreams were filled with her face, pale, hollow, and unblinking, just staring at me from the edge of the trees. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was just starting to rise, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I had barely slept, but the first light of day gave me a sense of relief. The eerie feeling was still there, though hanging in the air like a thick fog. I packed up my tent quickly, not bothering to make breakfast. I just wanted to leave. As I hiked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. Had I imagined her, or had she really been out there? I kept telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the unease settled in my chest, tight and unyielding. By the time I made it back to the parking lot and my car, I felt a strange sense of calm. The normal world felt so far removed from that dark, silent forest, and I wanted to forget everything that had happened. But something had changed in me, a quiet, nagging thought that would not leave. She was out there, somewhere. I haven't gone camping since that trip. I still enjoy being outdoors, but I stick to well-populated areas now. I never saw that woman again, but there's a part of me that knows I wasn't imagining her. And every time I hear rustling in the trees, every time I find myself alone in the woods, I can't help but think back to that moment. The feeling of being watched, the unsettling sensation of her eyes on me from the darkness. Some things once seen are never forgotten. The rain hadn't stopped for hours, a constant downpour, the kind that makes everything feel like it's sinking into the earth, with no escape from the wet cold. The campfire that had been burning so brightly earlier in the evening was nothing but a heap of smoldering ash now, the warmth long gone, chased away by the relentless rain. I sat in the small canvas tent, the thin fabric not offering much protection, and listened to the sound of the rain hammering against the roof. The rustling of the trees just outside the tent mixed with the steady drip-drip of water pooling in the ground. My name is Lucas, and I was supposed to be enjoying a peaceful camping trip in the French countryside with my friend, Matt. We'd planned this trip for weeks, looking forward to getting away from the city, away from everything. The idea was simple. A couple of days in the woods, just the two of us, hiking, fishing, and being out in nature. A little escape from our busy lives. But it hadn't turned out quite the way I imagined. It all started when we arrived at the campsite, a remote spot in the hills near a tiny village called Montilou, the kind of place where the streets are narrow, the houses old and worn, and the locals barely speak a word of English. Matt and I had driven out from Paris, the 4-hour drive turning into 6 thanks to some bad weather and getting lost in the winding country roads. The rain had started to pick up as we made our way up the mountain, and by the time we reached the site, it was coming down in sheets. Still, we set up camp. The tent was pitched, the fire was lit, and for a brief moment we were content. Felt like an adventure, but then things started to go wrong. It was around dusk when we heard the first strange noise. Matt and I were sitting by the fire, the smell of wet earth mixing with the smoke of burning wood. We both froze when we heard it. A faint rustling in the trees, something moving just beyond the edge of the camp. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but there was something off about it. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone was walking through the woods, trying to stay hidden. Matt, always the practical one, didn't seem too concerned. He shrugged it off and tossed another log onto the fire, the flames flickering higher. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods were too quiet, and I didn't like how everything seemed to be holding its breath. Probably just some animals, Matt said, trying to convince himself as much as me. I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. As the night wore on, the rain began to fall heavier, and the temperature dropped. We retreated to the tent, our clothes damp and our shoes caked in mud. The sound of the rain was deafening, drowning out everything else. Inside the tent, we huddled in our sleeping bags, both of us silently trying to fall asleep, but the tension from earlier still hanging in the air. It wasn't until I started to drift off that I heard the noise again, a tapping sound, not on the tent but on the ground outside. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around the campsite. I didn't say anything to Matt. I didn't want to worry him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night passed slowly, the rain never letting up, and when morning finally came, I was exhausted. I stepped out of the tent, the cold air biting at my skin as I surveyed the campsite. Everything looked normal at first glance. Wet, muddy, and quiet, but there was something I couldn't quite place. The trees seemed to loom a little too close, their branches swaying in the wind, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. Matt had already started breakfast, the smell of burned toast and coffee filling the air. He seemed unfazed by the night's events, acting like it was just another camping trip. But I wasn't so sure. Something felt off. The tension in the air from last night hadn't disappeared. "We should go out and do some hiking today," Matt said, flipping the toast over the fire. "Get out of this place for a while." I didn't want to say it, but I was starting to feel uncomfortable. The forest felt too thick, too suffocating. The idea of being out there, alone and vulnerable, was becoming less and less appealing. But I didn't want to ruin the trip, so I forced myself to agree. We packed up our gear and set out into the woods, the rain still pouring down in sheets. The trail was muddy, the ground slippery beneath our boots. We walked for hours, the only sounds being the rain and our footsteps. It should have been peaceful, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that made every snap of a twig or rustling of leaves make me jump. Around noon, we stumbled upon something strange. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, hidden deep in the woods, half swallowed by the overgrown brush. The roof had caved in, and the windows were cracked, some of them broken completely. There were no signs of life around it, no footprints, no trails leading up to it. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. "What do you think?" Matt asked, eyeing the cabin with curiosity. I wasn't sure what to think. The cabin was a curiosity, but it felt wrong, like it had been forgotten for a reason. I suggested we keep moving, but Matt, always the explorer, insisted we take a look inside. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We pushed open the door, the rusted hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the air was stale, musty, and cold. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we moved further in, our flashlights sweeping across the room. It was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and debris scattered around. There was an old stove in the corner, but it hadn't been used in years. There was something unsettling about the place, the way it felt abandoned but still waiting. After a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy. Something about the silence felt too heavy, too oppressive. I mentioned it to Matt, but he just shrugged, telling me I was overthinking things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to leave, and as we stepped back out into the rain, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints around the cabin, not from animals, but from human feet. Fresh prints, too, as if someone had just been here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice sharp with unease. Matt didn't argue. We made our way back to the camp, the unease growing with each step. The rain had stopped for a moment, and the forest seemed quieter than before. We didn't speak much as we walked, both of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until we reached the campsite that I realized something was off. The tent was gone. It was gone, vanished, just like that. There was no sign of it anywhere, no trace of where it had been. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, panic beginning to set in. Matt was silent beside me, his face pale. We searched the area, calling out for the tent, but there was no sign of it. It was like the forest had swallowed it whole. I checked the area where the tent had been set up, and I found something strange. A small, muddy footprint leading into the woods. Someone had been here. We followed the footprints, our footsteps heavy and quick in the mud. The trail led us deeper into the woods, winding through trees and over rocks, until it brought us to the edge of a steep ravine. There, at the bottom, we found the tent. It wasn't the same tent we'd set up. This one was torn and shredded, the fabric ripped as if something had attacked it. There was a smell in the air, something rotten and decayed. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I turned away, but Matt was already moving closer. Then we heard it, a crackling noise coming from somewhere in the distance. It was faint at first, like a radio tuning into a station, but it grew louder, clearer. And then we saw him, a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face hidden by a hood. He stood at the edge of the ravine, staring at us. I couldn't make out his features, but I felt the weight of his gaze, cold and calculating. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The moment I saw him, I knew we had to get out of there. Slowly, we backed away, keeping our eyes on him. He didn't move. He just stood there watching us. I don't know how long we stood there, but eventually, the man turned and disappeared into the woods. We didn't waste any time after that. We made a run for it, scrambling back through the woods and down the trail to the nearest road. We didn't stop until we reached the village of Montilou. There, we found a small inn and we stayed the night. The next morning, the sun was out, the air crisp and clean. It felt like a different world from the one we had just escaped. We never spoke about what happened. Matt didn't want to, and I didn't have the words, but we both knew something had happened in those woods. Something we couldn't explain. We never went back. It was the summer of 2012, and I had decided to take a much-needed break from the grind of everyday life. Work had been draining, and I was looking for something simple and quiet. Just me, the woods, and a few days to clear my head. I wasn't exactly a seasoned camper, but I knew enough to get by. My friends, Andrew and Chris, had been teasing me about being a city boy, but I was determined to prove them wrong. I could handle a couple of days in the wild. We drove out from our hometown in Washington State to an old, abandoned campsite near the edge of the Olympic National Forest. This place had been unused for decades, a relic of a time when people actually camped out there. I found the idea of it appealing, the isolation, the quiet. I needed that. No phone signal, no interruptions, just nature. I liked the idea of getting away from everything, especially since my life had been filled with noise lately. The drive was long, winding through forests, with the occasional view of the rugged mountains in the distance. The air felt fresher as we climbed higher, the trees becoming denser, towering overhead like silent giants. The sky was clouded, but the rain hadn't yet begun, though I could feel it coming in the distance. It was one of those summer storms that could roll in quickly and without warning. As we pulled into the abandoned campsite, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just the feeling of being somewhere forgotten. The ground was overgrown with grass and weeds, and the small wooden cabins, once used by campers, were now decaying, with cracked windows and roofs that had long ago caved in. I tried not to think too much about it, telling myself that it was just a bit of old history. I unloaded our gear with Andrew and Chris, setting up tents near the remains of what had once been a fire pit. The woods surrounded us on all sides, the towering trees blocking out the fading light from the setting sun. By the time we finished setting up camp, the first few drops of rain started to fall. We retreated into our tents and began to prepare a simple dinner, our laughter filling the air as we cracked open beers and joked around. I could hear the steady drumming of rain against the canvas, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. It felt like the perfect escape. But as the evening wore on, A strange feeling kept gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest around us felt too still. There were no animals, no rustling of leaves in the wind, no sounds of insects, just silence, broken only by the sound of rain and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like we weren't as alone as I had hoped. My mind kept drifting to the abandoned cabins, the ones that seemed so out of place in the midst of the forest. Why had they been left behind? Why hadn't anyone come here in years? Chris was the first to mention it. He was sitting across from me, staring into the flickering light of the campfire, his face lit by the orange glow. "You ever wonder why this place was abandoned?" he asked, his voice low. I had thought the same thing earlier, but hearing it out loud made it sound so much worse. I shrugged, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just because it's so isolated," I said. "People don't come out here much anymore." Andrew, who had been quiet up until that point, looked around, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "Yeah, well, I've got a bad feeling about this place." I gave him a sideways glance, trying to dismiss his unease. "It's fine. We're just here to relax. Nothing's going to happen." But as I spoke the words, a strange sensation washed over me. I glanced up at the darkening sky, the clouds thickening, and felt that heavy weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. The tension in the air was palpable, but no one said anything more. We just sat in silence, the sound of the rain the only thing that filled the space between us. As the night wore on, the storm outside grew worse. The rain came down harder, and the wind began to howl through the trees. It sounded almost unnatural, like the forest itself was alive and restless. I crawled into my tent, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my stomach. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind that rattled the tent walls, made my heart race a little faster. Something didn't feel right. At some point, I must have drifted off, though I wasn't sure when. I woke up suddenly, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground outside my tent jolting me upright. My heart hammered in my chest, and I lay still, listening. The rain continued to fall, but now there was another sound. A soft thumping, like footsteps, just outside the edge of the camp. It wasn't the sound of animals. It was too deliberate, too human. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, a faint whisper, like someone calling out. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. I stuck my head out, scanning the camp. The fire was now nothing but glowing embers, and everything else was swallowed by the darkness. I saw no one. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was out in the middle of nowhere, in a storm with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us. I sat in my tent, waiting, but nothing happened. The rain continued to pour, and eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every small noise outside kept me on edge. I don't think I got more than an hour of sleep that night. The next morning, I woke up to find the storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, misty forest. The air was thick with moisture, and the smell of wet earth filled my lungs. I crawled out of my tent, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the night before. Andrew and Chris were already up, sitting around the fire pit, poking at the remnants of the firewood. Neither of them seemed to notice that I was on edge. We spent the day hiking around the area, exploring the old cabins and the overgrown trails. Everything seemed normal during the day. Bright sunlight filtered through the trees, and birds chirped overhead. But every time I passed the cabins, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me from inside them. As the sun began to set, we sat around the fire once again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I glanced around nervously, but no one else seemed to notice. I could see the trees swaying in the wind, and I could hear something else now, something faint, a scraping noise coming from the direction of the cabins. Without saying a word, I stood up, my heart racing. I made my way over to the closest cabin, the one that looked like it had collapsed the most. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the broken windows were dark and empty. As I approached, the scraping noise stopped. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find something or someone inside. But the cabin was empty. It was just as abandoned as I had thought. And yet, the hairs on my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the trees around me. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I stayed in my tent, fully awake, listening to every sound in the forest. The wind had picked up again, and the trees creaked in the distance. The strange scraping noise had returned, but this time it was closer. It was coming from the abandoned cabin. I wanted to leave. I wanted to pack up and head back to the car, to the safety of the world I knew. But for some reason, I stayed. Maybe I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I thought I could make it through the night. The next morning, we packed up and left without saying much to each other. We didn't need to. We all knew. None of us spoke of it, but we all felt the same thing. The woods had never felt more alive with secrets. As I drove away, the sight of the abandoned campsite in my rearview mirror felt like a weight lifted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us. Something that watched us quietly in the shadows. Something that would remain in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. I never went camping in the woods again after that. Some places are better left forgotten. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the woods, away from the constant noise and distractions of city life, that brought me peace. But this trip, in the fall of 2019, would be different. Something I couldn't have anticipated, no matter how many nights I'd spent in the wilderness before. I planned this camping trip as a solo retreat. It had been a rough year. Between work stress and personal issues, I needed to clear my head. The spot I chose was in a remote part of the Adirondacks. Quiet, secluded, and just far enough off the beaten path that I knew I wouldn't run into anyone. I arrived around mid-afternoon, unloading my gear from the back of my old truck. The weather was crisp but clear, with a slight breeze that rustled the last few leaves still clinging to the trees. It was the perfect kind of day for hiking and setting up camp. I set up my tent by a small stream, the sound of the water adding to the calmness of the place. I didn't mind the isolation. I relished it. As I got the fire going that evening, I noticed how the sky quickly darkened. The sun seemed to drop behind the trees so fast it felt unnatural. Before long, the woods were bathed in darkness, the only light coming from my fire and the stars above. The night settled in, and I sat by the fire, cooking some canned beans, the smell of the food filling the air. I heard the usual sounds of the forest, leaves rustling, the occasional bird call, and the distant howls of wolves or coyotes. I felt comfortable, at ease. This was what I needed. But then, around midnight, something changed. The air turned unnervingly still. The forest went quiet. No rustling leaves, no animal noises, nothing. The silence was so deep that I began to feel like the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the wind settling down. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, and the flames crackled, offering some comfort. But then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The footsteps weren't loud enough to be an animal. It sounded human. I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight at my side. I didn't want to overreact. Could just be another hiker, someone else out for a night stroll. But something about it didn't feel right. I had chosen this spot specifically because it was far from any marked trails. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. The footsteps continued, closer now. I turned off the fire for a moment, trying to listen. I didn't hear breathing or voices, just the crunch of leaves underfoot. My mind raced, wondering if someone had somehow found their way into this secluded part of the forest. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in front of me. The footsteps had stopped. I scanned the area, but all I saw was the forest stretching out, the shadows deepening as the night grew darker. I exhaled, relieved, but the unease still lingered. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. I told myself that it was nothing to worry about. I spent the next few minutes in silence, waiting, but nothing happened. I was starting to convince myself that I had imagined it when I heard the sound again. This time it was closer, way too close. I could tell it wasn't an animal anymore. The footsteps were heavy, almost deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there was moving toward my camp. I froze. I shouldn't have been so calm. I should have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. Something inside me told me to wait, to see who it was, what it was. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of my camp. I could feel the presence of someone or something just beyond the circle of light from my fire. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. And then I heard a rustling, followed by a low grunt. My flashlight flickered as I turned it toward the sound. There, just outside the reach of the light, was a dark figure. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall silhouette standing still. I didn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had no idea what I was dealing with. Was it a person, a hunter, or something else entirely? The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The air was thick with tension, and every instinct in my body told me to act. Run, fight, scream, anything, but I couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally shifted, took a step forward, then another. Slowly, it stepped into the circle of light. I held my breath as it emerged fully into view. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be. He was dressed in old, worn-out clothes, ripped jeans, a torn flannel shirt, and boots that were caked in dirt. His face was grimy, his hair matted and long, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were wide, wild, and filled with an eerie, almost crazed intensity. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I ask if he needed help? But something told me not to. Something told me to be quiet, to not make any sudden moves. For a long time, we just stood there, staring at each other. I could hear the distant sounds of the woods again, the rustle of leaves, the faint chirping of crickets. But this man didn't move. He just watched me. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before he finally turned around and began walking away, slowly fading into the dark. I didn't wait to see where he went. I didn't wait to see if he was coming back. I grabbed my gear, packed everything up as quickly as I could, and climbed into my truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't care that it was late or that I had no real destination. I just needed to get away. But as I drove down the narrow road, away from the camp, my mind kept replaying the encounter over and over. Who was that man? What was he doing out there, alone in the woods at that hour? It wasn't until I reached the nearest gas station, nearly an hour away, that I realized something else. Something that sent a cold chill down my spine. I hadn't heard a gunshot, or the sound of someone chopping wood, or anything that would have indicated he was part of a group. But there was something else. Something that I noticed when I was packing my truck. Something I hadn't caught in the moment. The man's face, the look in his eyes. It wasn't just wild. It was desperate. And his clothes, those weren't just worn-out camping clothes. They were clothes that looked like they'd been worn for days, maybe even weeks. As I sat there in my truck, trying to calm my racing heart, I suddenly realized what that strange figure had been. He wasn't a hunter. He wasn't even a lost hiker. He was someone who had been out there for much longer than I had. Someone who had been living in the woods. Someone who was either lost or worse. Someone who had no intention of leaving. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, without looking back. I don't know what happened to that man, but one thing was for sure. I would never camp in that spot again. The woods have their own rules, and some things once seen can never be unseen. I remember that camping trip as though it were yesterday. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a few days out in the wild to disconnect from the world, get some fresh air, and maybe catch a few game animals for the freezer. But as much as I wanted it to be a peaceful retreat, the forest had other plans. The year was 2023. I was 31 years old, and after years of living in the city, I had finally managed to carve out a little bit of space for a trip with a close friend. His name was Mark. We'd known each other since college, and over the years, we'd done a lot of hunting and camping together. But this time, we decided to push further into the wild, further than we'd ever been before. The location was a remote stretch of the Blue Ridge Mountains, tucked away in a part of Virginia where few people dared to venture. It wasn't marked on any tourist maps, and the closest town was nearly a 3-hour drive away. Our gear was packed. Our plans were simple. Camp, hunt, and relax. No phone service. No distractions. Just the wilderness and us. We set out early on a Friday morning, driving through miles of winding roads, leaving behind civilization. The air felt different as we approached the base of the mountains. Cleaner, sharper, and with the scent of pine and wet earth hanging in the air. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was starting to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the forest floor. We set up camp near an old hunting cabin, a dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't seen any real use in decades. The wood was weathered, and the roof sagged in places, but it gave us a sense of comfort. We weren't too far from the cabin, but far enough to still feel isolated. We unpacked our gear and set up a fire ring. As the fire crackled to life, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was out there. Not just quiet like the city when everyone's asleep. This was a silence so deep, it almost felt suffocating. There were no birds calling, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just the fire popping and the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of something unknown. That first night, we didn't do much besides eat, drink, and talk. Mark was an experienced hunter, but we were both aware of how isolated we were. The idea of running into other people out here was almost laughable. This was wilderness territory, untamed and untouched. The next morning, we woke up before the sun and made our way into the forest. I remember the trees seemed taller than I'd ever seen before, their trunks thick and gnarled, reaching up toward the gray sky like twisted fingers. It was cold, the air biting at my skin, and the ground was wet with the dew of the night. We tracked for hours, moving slowly through the underbrush, keeping our eyes peeled for any sign of deer or wild boar. Mark was ahead of me, navigating the terrain with ease. I, on the other hand, was still getting used to the rugged landscape, tripping over roots and slipping on the wet ground. By noon, we had covered several miles, and I was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. We took a break to eat some jerky and drink water, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of a clearing. The forest around us was still eerily quiet, not a single animal in sight. "Let's head back to camp," Mark suggested, wiping his hands on his pants. "There's no sign of anything out here." I agreed, and we started making our way back. It wasn't until we were halfway through the forest that things began to feel off. At first, it was just a sense of unease. You know that feeling when someone's watching you, but you can't pinpoint who or what? That's how it started. A constant itch on the back of my neck. A subtle shift in the air, like something had changed. Mark seemed to notice it too, but he didn't say anything. His usual confident stride had slowed, and his eyes darted around more frequently. "We're not alone," he muttered, barely audible. I didn't ask him what he meant. I felt it too. We moved a little faster, our steps quickening as the unease grew. The trees began to close in on us, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the leaves made me jump, my heart racing in my chest. And then we heard it, a low growl somewhere off to our left. Not a wolf or a coyote, but something deeper, more guttural. It rumbled through the forest, vibrating the very ground beneath us. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Mark, who had turned pale at the sound, grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a tree. "Stay still," he whispered urgently. I didn't need to be told twice. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. The growl came again, this time closer, and I could almost feel the ground shake beneath me. Something large was moving through the underbrush, and it wasn't alone. Mark motioned for me to follow, and we started moving again, keeping as quiet as possible. We tried to backtrack toward the cabin, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly, every path leading us in circles. The growls became more frequent, closer with each passing moment. It wasn't until we stumbled upon a clearing that we finally saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, moving between the trees. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was struggling to maintain some semblance of balance. But there was something wrong about it. Its posture was off, its gait too erratic. And then it turned. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a twisted mess of features. Pale, gaunt skin stretched over a skull that was too long, too thin. Its eyes were the worst part. They were wide, like they didn't belong to a human at all. Too big, too dark. And they were locked onto us. I could feel the air grow heavier, the forest pressing in on us. My legs wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Mark didn't say anything, but I saw him reach for his rifle, his hands shaking. The figure started moving toward us, dragging its feet with a strange, limp motion. And then it stopped. It was no more than 20 feet away from us, its head tilted in a way that wasn't natural. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too sharp, too jagged. It let out a sound that was half snarling, half screeching, a noise that sent a chill down my spine. I remember looking at Mark, my mind racing. We were outmatched. There was no way we could outrun it. There was no way we could fight it. We were on its turf, but we had to try. Mark raised his rifle, his hands shaking so badly I could barely hear the click of the safety coming off. He fired. The shot echoed through the forest, deafening in its intensity. But the figure didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge the bullet. Took a step forward and then another. It was getting closer. Without thinking, I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the cabin. We ran, adrenaline pumping through my veins, heart hammering in my chest. Behind us, I could hear the creature, No, the thing moving as well, its heavy footsteps crushing the ground underfoot. We made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. We barred the door with whatever we could find. Logs, broken furniture, anything. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind spinning with panic. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't dare make a sound. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind that rattled the windows made us jump. We sat in silence, watching the shadows stretch across the room, waiting for something to happen. And it did. The next morning, we cautiously opened the door, half expecting to see that thing waiting for us. But it was gone. The forest was still quiet, unnervingly so. We ventured out, our rifles ready, but there was no sign of the creature. No tracks, no blood, nothing. For days, we stayed in that cabin, too scared to venture far from it. We would hear it sometimes, those low, guttural growls coming from the woods, but we never saw it again. It wasn't until we were packing up to leave that I found something I hadn't noticed before, a set of tracks. But these tracks weren't from any animal I knew. They were too large, too deep in the mud, and they led straight into the forest, disappearing into the trees. We left that day, never speaking about it again. Mark and I never went camping together after that, and neither of us ever mentioned what happened out there in the mountains. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered. There's no name for it, no way to categorize it. But I know one thing for sure, whatever it was hunting us. And if we'd stayed much longer, I don't think we'd have made it out. The forest is still silent even now, years later. But sometimes, I still hear that growl in my dreams. It was a quiet Friday evening in late October when I made the decision to camp alone at a small rural cemetery about a 2-hour drive from my place. The kind of cemetery that's been forgotten over time, tucked away on the outskirts of a quiet town, bordered by dense woods. I had been driving for what felt like forever, the leaves in the trees beginning to turn, casting the landscape in shades of orange, yellow, and red. It was the sort of place people pass by and forget, a place that holds its stories in silence. I wasn't trying to get away from anything, not really. I just wanted some solitude, something different. The idea of camping out in the open, under the stars, surrounded by history, intrigued me. The cemetery was small, with crumbling gravestones and a few old oak trees scattered around. Some of the headstones had been weathered so much that they were hard to read. The graveyard itself felt isolated, just the right amount of distance from any sign of life. I parked my truck at the edge of the cemetery, where the path leading to the graves met a small clearing. The ground was slightly uneven, the grass wild in places, but I figured it was as good a spot as any to set up my tent. The air was cool, and the ground felt damp under my boots as I stepped out of the truck and began unloading my gear. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant chirping of crickets. I could feel the weight of the stillness in the air. Setting up camp didn't take long. I unrolled the tent and staked it to the ground, then laid out my sleeping bag inside. The light was fading quickly, and I could feel the temperature dropping. I gathered a few fallen branches from around the cemetery and built a small fire near the edge, just far enough from the graves that it didn't feel disrespectful. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow around me. I sat back, watching the fire crackle and feeling the peacefulness of the place settle around me. As the darkness deepened, I pulled a jacket on and sat beside the fire, eating a simple meal. The only company I had was the occasional owl hooting from the trees and the gentle rustle of the wind through the leaves. There was something comforting about the isolation, something serene in the quiet. I hadn't planned on staying up too late, but as the hours passed, I found myself lingering by the fire, the shadows from the flames dancing across the gravestones. I don't know when it started, But eventually, I began to notice something. The air, which had been still all night, seemed to shift. There was a faint sound, almost like footsteps, coming from the edge of the woods. At first, I brushed it off as an animal or perhaps the wind shifting branches, but the sounds didn't stop. It was like someone was walking around, carefully, just out of sight. I told myself not to overthink it. This place was quiet, but it wasn't exactly off limits. It was a public cemetery, after all. I tried to dismiss the thought, but my instincts were on edge. I stood up from my spot by the fire and walked toward the edge of the clearing, near the first row of gravestones. The sounds stopped as I got closer, but my nerves still hummed with unease. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. My eyes darted around the cemetery, scanning the darkness between the gravestones. There was no one there, but the feeling of being observed wouldn't go away. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just my imagination. People had passed through here during the day. Maybe someone had just wandered off for a walk or had gotten lost. But then I saw it. A figure just beyond the trees at the far side of the cemetery. A shadow, tall and thin, standing motionless, watching me. It wasn't anything definite, just a dark silhouette against the trees. My heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, and I stood frozen, unsure whether to move toward it or away. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. Just like that, it had disappeared. My breath came out in a slow exhale, and I felt the weight of my pulse in my ears. I must have imagined it, I told myself. It was probably just the shadows from the fire playing tricks on me. I stood there for a few more minutes, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. When nothing happened, I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the odd feeling in my stomach. It had to be nothing, right? Just the nerves of being alone in such a quiet, isolated place. But then I heard it again. A footstep, clear and deliberate. This time it was closer. I spun around, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the sound of someone moving, stepping carefully on the ground, was unmistakable. I thought about the truck, the keys in my pocket, the distance between me and the nearest town. My mind raced, calculating the best way to handle whatever this was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was just another person who had wandered in, someone with bad timing. I took a few steps toward the edge of the cemetery, straining my eyes in the dim light. That's when I saw it again. A shadow, tall and thin, moving among the gravestones, but this time, it wasn't standing still. It was walking, slowly, deliberately, towards me. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no accident. The way it moved, so calculated, so deliberate, made my stomach drop. I had no idea who it was, but I could feel the tension in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time that night, I felt truly afraid. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the figure, but it didn't seem to be in any hurry. It moved between the graves like it knew exactly where it was going, as though it had been there before. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I turned my back to the fire and walked quickly toward the tent, my breath coming faster now. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to pack up and get out of there. But I didn't know if that was the right move. If it was just someone else camping out or wandering through the cemetery, then I'd look foolish for overreacting. The footsteps grew louder, and I broke into a full run toward the tent, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook. I crawled inside, heart racing. I pulled the flap closed behind me, my breath echoing in my ears. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the stillness outside, I realized something. I wasn't alone. That much was certain, and I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I hadn't planned for anything more than a few days of hiking, campfires, and maybe some fishing. Just me, a couple of friends, and the woods. The kind of thing where you forget the noise of the world and get back to something simple. You know, the kind of camping where the hardest decision is whether to eat your granola bar before the hike or after. But that was before we arrived at the campsite. Before things started to feel wrong. I had met Sean and Derek a few years ago when I started working at a small tech company. We weren't the best of friends, but we got along fine. And when Derek suggested a camping trip up in the foothills, I was up for it. The weather was perfect, and I hadn't been out in the wilderness in a long time. Felt like the kind of thing I needed, a break from my usual routine. We left early on a Friday morning, packed up our gear, and made the 2-hour drive to the site. The place was far enough out of town that you couldn't see any houses. No streetlights, no sound from the highway, just the quiet hum of the trees swaying in the wind and the occasional bird overhead. It was exactly what we were looking for, peace and solitude. The campsite itself was nestled between a thick line of pine trees, just off a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. We set up the tents near a stream, where the sound of running water was soothing and gave a sense of comfort. After setting up the camp, we got the fire going and spent the evening talking, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the view of the sun setting behind the hills. Nothing felt off about the place at first. It was only after nightfall when things began to shift. We sat around the campfire for hours, sharing stories, when Derek, always the one with the wild ideas, started talking about creepy stuff. It wasn't unusual for him to bring up a good ghost story or something about local legends. He was a big fan of anything that made people uneasy. I didn't mind it. Sometimes it was fun to get spooked. "Hey, you guys ever heard of the guy they call the Wood Man around here?" Derek asked, his voice lowered like he was telling us something serious. I wasn't sure what he meant, but Sean leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. I had no idea where this was going. "Well, apparently, there's this guy who stalks campers in the woods," Derek said, grinning. "They say he's been around for years, just waiting for someone to slip up. He'll watch them from the trees, make sure they don't know he's there, and when the time's right, well, let's just say no one ever sees him coming." I rolled my eyes, trying to brush it off. Sounds like a myth, but Derek wasn't done. He went on about how there had been several disappearances in these woods over the years. People who'd gone missing without a trace. Sometimes it wasn't just hikers who disappeared. It was hunters, 2 men with rifles who never came back. The way Derek told the story, it sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. "You know," I said, trying to shake the tension from my body, "the more you talk, the less I want to go to sleep." The conversation switched to something else, but I couldn't help but feel a nagging sensation in the pit of my stomach. The woods were beautiful, but as I looked out into the blackness beyond the firelight, they felt too quiet, almost like they were holding their breath. I tried to brush it off and crawled into my tent, telling myself that it was just the normal nervousness that came with being out in nature. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept hearing sounds, branches cracking, something moving in the distance. Every time I opened my eyes, it felt like the world outside was closing in. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but it couldn't have been long. The next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I stayed perfectly still, listening intently. They weren't the normal sounds of animals that you hear at night. No rustling leaves, no distant howls. This was different. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They weren't in the distance either. They were right outside my tent. I held my breath, hoping the sounds would go away. Maybe it was Derek playing a prank on me. He had a way of sneaking up on people, but this didn't feel like one of his jokes. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear breathing, deep, ragged breaths like someone struggling to stay quiet. My heart raced. I slowly, silently unzipped the tent just a fraction, enough to peek outside. My eyes locked onto the darkness. There was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. The footsteps never came back, but I heard something else. A low, drawn-out whistle that seemed to echo through the trees. My mind raced. Could it have been a bird? A creature? No, it was too deliberate, too human. When dawn finally broke, I couldn't get out of that tent fast enough. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting me like a slap in the face. I quickly scanned the campsite, nothing out of the ordinary. Derek and Sean were still asleep, oblivious to whatever had kept me awake. I didn't tell them what I heard. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I was just too on edge. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The day passed uneventfully. We hiked further into the woods, staying mostly on the main trails, sticking to familiar paths. There was something about the woods now, though, something that made every tree seem a little darker, every rustling sound a little more threatening. By the time we made it back to camp, I could barely wait to settle in for the night. But the sun was still up, so we decided to fish by the stream. It wasn't long before we heard it, a rustling sound. At first, we all thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the noise wasn't normal. It was too close, too deliberate. Someone, or something, was moving around in the woods nearby. I tried to stay calm, but my eyes kept darting from shadow to shadow. Derek and Sean weren't talking, their focus trained on the noise as well. It was impossible to ignore. Then it happened. A figure stepped out of the woods, half hidden by the trees. It was a man, tall, lanky, his face partially obscured by the darkness. But what really stood out was his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and fixed on us. For a moment, no one moved. My heart was pounding in my chest. Who was this guy? What was he doing out here? He didn't say a word. He just stood there watching us. And then, without turning away, he slowly stepped back into the trees, disappearing from sight. We didn't wait around to see if he was coming back. We packed up the fishing gear in a rush, hardly speaking to each other, and made our way back to the campsite. The entire walk back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The rustling in the trees was too constant, too precise. That night, we didn't sit around the campfire. We didn't talk or joke. We stayed inside our tents, waiting for something, anything to happen. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. At some point during the night, I heard the footsteps again. Not just outside my tent this time. They were all around us, coming from all directions. And then the whistle, the same long, drawn-out sound from the night before. I was done. Whatever this was, I wasn't staying another night. I woke Derek and Sean, whispering urgently for them to wake up. We need to go. Now. They didn't question me. They could hear it too. We packed up our gear quickly, not caring about being quiet anymore. We had to leave, had to get out of those woods. As we made our way back to the trailhead, we didn't stop to look around. We just moved as fast as we could, our breath coming out in sharp gasps. And finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the car. When we got back to the city, I thought I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that whatever we had encountered in those woods wasn't done yet. And as I sit here now, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape that feeling. It wasn't a legend. It wasn't a myth. It was real. And I'm not sure that man, the one who had been watching us from the trees, was ever really alone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of the forest. I had always been the type to enjoy solitude, and the woods had always provided the escape I needed from the bustle of everyday life. The kind of escape that felt real, not like the crowded beaches or busy parks where you can never really get away from people. This time, I picked a secluded spot near the edge of the forest, far enough from any hiking trail or campsite. A place that looked untouched by the hands of others. I had been planning this for weeks, just a weekend, really to unwind. I wasn't expecting anything strange. Nothing out of the ordinary, just me and my thoughts. There's something calming about the rhythm of nature, about being surrounded by trees and the occasional sound of wildlife in the distance. I arrived just before sundown. The air was crisp, and the sky had that perfect orange hue as the sun dipped behind the treeline. The cool breeze rustled the leaves, and I felt that familiar sense of peace settle over me. I found a spot, set up my tent, and started a small fire to keep me warm as the temperature dropped. There was nothing around but trees for miles, and for the first time in a while, I felt truly alone. The night stretched on, and I sat by the fire, poking the wood with a stick. The flames flickered in the dark, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. I felt the quiet settle deeper, until it almost felt like the world had completely stopped. The kind of silence that presses in on you, thick and palpable. You can hear every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, like the forest itself is breathing. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint rustling, like someone moving through the brush. I paused, listening. The sound stopped as soon as I perked up, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. It's common for animals to wander around at night, after all. But then I heard it again, a little closer this time. The leaves crunched underfoot, unmistakable. I stood up slowly, reaching for the flashlight in my bag. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, in case it was just a deer or something else harmless. But then I heard it again, a branch snapping nearby, like something bigger was moving through the woods. I couldn't help myself. My heart started to beat a little faster. My instincts told me it wasn't a normal animal. The sound was too deliberate, too heavy. For a moment, I stood still, listening to the forest. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The quiet stretched on for what felt like ages. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle in the distance. I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on, and scanned the trees around me. The beam sliced through the dark, revealing nothing but shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. Between the trees, far in the distance, I noticed a figure, a man. His silhouette was tall, but there was something off about him. He was standing still, staring straight ahead, unmoving. The beam of my flashlight reflected off his eyes, and for a moment, I froze. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge the light. He was just there, watching. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone, as if the darkness had swallowed him up whole. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I had imagined it. But something told me I hadn't. My instincts told me to pack up and leave right then. But that wasn't an option. I was miles from the nearest town, and the sun had long since set. The night was my only company, so I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm my nerves. The air had grown colder, and the fire crackled louder than before. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just some random hiker passing through the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The night dragged on. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered. Every little sound, every rustling of the leaves, sent my heart racing. I couldn't relax, couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. Then, a new sound reached my ears. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the underbrush, moving closer. They weren't hurried, not panicked, just methodical, like someone who had all the time in the world. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands shaking. The beam swept through the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, just the soft sound of the night around me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I listened, straining to hear anything. The footsteps stopped. For a while, everything was still, and then it came again, this time closer. I stood up quickly, heart hammering in my chest. My thoughts raced. Was it the same figure I had seen earlier? Or was it someone else? Another camper, maybe? But who would be out here this late at night, in the middle of nowhere? I turned around in a circle, trying to spot anything that might explain the sounds. The forest was still dark, the trees whispering in the wind, but the footsteps kept coming, slowly, methodically. And then I saw it again, a shadow, this time much closer. A figure moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, but there, unmistakably. I could feel my pulse quicken. I should have left. I should have packed up and run back to the car, but something held me in place. Fear? Curiosity? I don't know. The figure stood still for a moment, just outside the range of my light, and then it moved again, this time toward me. Every instinct in my body screamed to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The shadow kept getting closer, moving with an unnatural slowness, as if it was savoring every moment. And then I saw it. The figure wasn't just a man. His clothes were ragged, torn, as if he had been out in the woods for days. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his face was gaunt, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were dark, wide, unblinking, locked on me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The way he moved, so slow, so deliberate, made my stomach churn. I finally forced myself to move, stumbling backward into the trees, away from the figure. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breaths were shallow. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get away from him. The man's eyes never left me as I backed away. He didn't speak. He didn't move any faster. He just kept coming step by slow step. And then I heard something else. Behind me, in the distance, I heard the sound of a vehicle, an engine humming in the night. I didn't know if it was a truck, a car, or something else entirely, but the sound brought a rush of relief. Someone else was out here. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't care what it was anymore. I just had to get away. I ran for what felt like miles, pushing through the underbrush and branches, not stopping until I saw the headlights of a car in the distance. It was a park ranger driving slowly down the trail, no doubt searching for lost hikers. I flagged him down, breathless and terrified. He didn't ask questions, just gestured for me to get in. As I climbed into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. The man, or whatever he was gone. But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. The ranger drove me back to the nearest town, where I could finally breathe again. I didn't tell him everything. Didn't need to. I knew no one would believe me. But the truth is, I'll never forget that figure. The way his eyes followed me, the slow, deliberate steps he took toward me in the dark. I don't know what he wanted or why he was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to find out. It was supposed to be just a regular hunting trip, nothing special. I had been going out to the woods since I was a kid, and every year, I take a week off to go camping and hunt the deer that roamed the mountain forests near my house. This time, though, I decided to go alone. It had been a rough year, and I needed some time away from everything to clear my head and get back to something simple. I didn't expect that trip to end with me questioning everything I thought I knew about the forest. The sun had already begun its descent behind the trees as I arrived at the edge of the dense pine forest. The air was cooler than I had expected for late autumn. the leaves already turning yellow and orange, carpeting the forest floor. My boots crunched against the dry, fallen leaves as I walked toward the spot I had marked out for the night. The place was tucked away in a remote corner of the forest, far enough that no one else bothered to camp there. It was a quiet place, where the sound of traffic or voices was swallowed up by the thick woods. Setting up camp was second nature to me at this point. I found a spot clear of rocks and stumps, and after a while, I had my small tent pitched, the campfire laid out with firewood stacked neatly nearby. I unpacked my gear, rifle, hunting knife, survival pack, and then, as a habit, I checked the weather again. The forecast had called for a slight chill, with no rain predicted, but you never knew when the weather could turn unexpectedly in the mountains. As night fell, the air grew colder, and I stoked the fire, watching the flames flicker and crackle. I pulled a thick jacket around my shoulders and sat down on a log, the smell of pine and smoke filling my senses. There was no sound now except the occasional rustle of branches overhead and the crackling of the fire. It felt peaceful, and that's exactly what I was looking for. A chance to recharge and forget about everything for a while. The first few hours of the night passed without incident. The fire cast long shadows that danced against the surrounding trees, and I had just started to doze off when I heard something. A snap, the unmistakable sound of a twig breaking underfoot, coming from the woods to my left. At first, I thought it was just an animal, deer maybe, or even a bear. I had encountered them before on hunting trips, though bears usually stayed well away from human camps. I grabbed my rifle instinctively, not quite sure why. Old habits die hard, but when nothing else happened, I put it back down and let out a slow breath. I should have paid more attention to that sound. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing things in the woods around me, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant growl of what could have been an animal, but I never heard any animals growling like that. It was low, almost human, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized I couldn't hear any other wildlife. No night birds, no distant calls of coyotes, not even the buzz of insects. The forest had gone eerily quiet. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just the isolation making my mind race. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned my head, I felt the prickling of eyes on the back of my neck. Finally, after what felt like hours of lying awake in the dark, I decided I needed to check it out. The fire was burning low now, casting only faint orange glows in the immediate area. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, making my way toward the trees. The wind had picked up slightly, and the branches above me creaked as the breeze moved through them. As I stepped deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. The forest was dense here, thick with tall, ancient pines. The light from my flashlight only stretched a few feet ahead of me, but it was enough to reveal the rough bark of the trees and the shadows that lurked between them. There was no sign of whatever had made the noise, but there was something else. I paused, scanning the area with my light. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks, but then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of my flashlight's beam, nearly blending into the dark trunks of the trees. My heart jumped in my chest. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its outline was hard to make out, but I could see that it was too thin. Its limbs were long, impossibly long, and it seemed to shift like it was never quite standing still. I froze, unable to take my eyes off it, as if moving would somehow provoke it. The figure didn't seem to notice me, or if it did, it didn't care. It was just there, standing like a dark sentinel in the woods, watching. I took a step back slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I had hunted in these woods for years, and I had never seen anything like this. Whatever it wasn't human. It was something else, something that didn't belong. Then, before I could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk, not exactly. It seemed to glide, or perhaps it crawled. its limbs stretched out in a way that made me shudder. It moved with a speed that didn't make sense for how awkward its body seemed. One moment it was far away, and the next it was close, much closer than I expected, its face hidden in the shadows. I bolted. No thought, no planning. Just raw survival instinct. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the dirt, my heart pounding in my chest. The crackling of the forest floor beneath my boots seemed to echo in the silence, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, I could hear it, the sound of movement, fast and deliberate, following me. I didn't stop running until I reached my camp, the fire now a faint, dying glow. I crashed through the trees, breathless and shaking, feeling the weight of panic settle in my chest. I grabbed my pack, shoved the rifle into my hands, and backed toward the fire. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed me all the way to camp. The air around me was still, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I stayed close to the fire, keeping watch. At times, I thought I heard the faintest rustling in the trees, but nothing came close enough to make me believe it was the thing I had seen. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. I packed my things as quickly as I could, every snap of a branch making me jump. I didn't want to stay another moment in that place. The hike back to my truck was a blur of exhaustion and fear. I didn't look back once. I just kept moving. When I finally reached the road, I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. I had made it out. The truck felt like a sanctuary as I climbed inside, but as I started the engine and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen was still out there, watching, waiting. The woods had always been familiar to me, but now they felt alien, dangerous. I never went back to that spot again. I don't think I ever will. Some things once seen can never be unremembered. Some things once encountered change you in ways you can't explain. Whatever I saw out there that night, whatever it was, I know it wasn't a trick of the mind or a wild animal. It was something else, something that doesn't belong in the woods. And I'll never know what it really was, but I know I never want to find out again. I never thought my uncle would leave me alone in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. My uncle, let's call him Greg, was the kind of man who never settled in one place. He always had a new plan, a new idea, something that kept him on the move. My dad used to call him a drifter. He'd pop in and out of our lives, never staying long. But he always had stories, wild stories about things he'd seen in the woods, on the road, in small towns nobody had ever heard of. I was 18 when he showed up again, his old truck rattling into our driveway. He had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was up to something. He told me he had a place, deep in the woods, that he wanted to show me, a real off-the-grid kind of spot. I was young and stupid. I liked the idea of getting away for a while, doing something different. We drove out early the next morning. The drive was long, and the roads got worse the farther we went. Paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt. The trees thickened, swallowing the sky, blocking out the sun. Felt like we were heading into another world. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was starting to set. It wasn't a normal campsite with numbered lots and fire pits. It was just a clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they felt like walls. There was no sign of other people, no sounds except the wind in the branches. The place felt old, untouched. Uncle Greg acted like it was the best place on earth. He set up a small fire, pulled out a few old camping supplies, and started talking about survival skills. How to track animals, how to find your way without a compass, how to start a fire with just a knife and some dry bark. I listened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt wrong. Maybe it was the quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The tent felt too thin, the darkness too deep. I kept hearing things, small rustlings in the undergrowth, the snap of a twig. Maybe just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. By morning, I was exhausted. Greg was already up, boiling water over the fire. He was acting strange, restless, said he was going to check something down by the creek. I asked if I should come, but he waved me off. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be back in a bit." He never came back. At first, I wasn't worried. Maybe he was hunting or just taking his time. But as the hours passed, the sun climbing higher, that uneasy feeling from the night before settled in deep. I waited. By late afternoon, I started walking toward the creek. It wasn't far, but when I got there, I found nothing. No footprints, no sign that he had ever been there. Just the slow-moving water, the trees, the silence. I called his name. Nothing. I walked farther, searching, but the woods all looked the same. I hadn't brought my phone. No service out here anyway. The truck keys were gone. I checked our campsite again, hoping maybe he had come back while I was gone. But his pack was missing. His sleeping bag, like he had just packed up and left. Panic started creeping in. I was miles from anything, deep in a part of the woods I didn't know. I had no way to call for help. No map, no compass. I was alone. At first, I told myself he'd come back. Maybe he had gone to get something and lost track of time. Maybe he'd found a better spot and was waiting for me to find him. I forced myself to stay calm. I collected firewood, made sure the fire stayed lit. But when night came, the fear really set in. The noises started again. Twigs snapping, something moving just beyond the light of the fire. I sat up, gripping the hunting knife Greg had left behind. The darkness felt alive. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had to face the truth. Greg wasn't coming back. I didn't know if he had abandoned me on purpose or if something had happened to him. Either way, I had two choices. Stay at the campsite and hope someone found me, or try to find my way back to civilization. I chose the second option. I packed what little I had, some jerky, a water bottle, the knife. I didn't know which way to go. The truck had come in from the east, but the trees were so thick I couldn't tell which way was which. I tried to follow the creek, hoping it would lead me to a road. The first few hours were fine, but as the sun climbed, I started feeling like I was going in circles. The woods all looked the same. The trees pressed in on me, thick and endless. The ground sloped in ways I hadn't noticed before. And then I found the first thing that made my stomach drop. A footprint. Fresh. Too big to be mine. I wasn't alone. I stopped, listening. Nothing but the wind. But that feeling, that crawling feeling on the back of my neck, it was stronger now. I kept moving, faster. Then I found something worse. A rope, hanging from a tree, swaying slightly. The knot was old, weathered, but the meaning was clear. Somebody had been here before. I didn't stick around. I moved fast, too fast. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, scraping my hands and knees. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Another footprint, closer this time. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found something that saved me. A dirt road. Just a thin, overgrown path, but a road nonetheless. I followed it. Hours later, I found an old cabin, boarded up, falling apart. But it was shelter. I checked the door, locked. I circled it, looking for anything useful. And then I heard it. Movement. Something was in the trees. Not an animal. Footsteps. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering. A man stepped out of the trees. Not Greg. He was tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked worn and dirty. He stared at me, unblinking. He didn't say a word. I didn't wait. I bolted, running back toward the road. I heard him move behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out. Then I saw headlights, a truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The truck skidded to a stop. An older man behind the wheel looked at me, startled. I didn't have the breath to explain. I just pointed behind me, but when I looked back, the man from the woods was gone. The driver took me to the nearest town. I called my parents. Greg was never found. The police searched, but they never found a body. No sign of him, no sign of the truck. Like he had never been there at all. I don't know if he left me on purpose or if something took him. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. Work had been wearing me down, and I just needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I wasn't an expert outdoorsman or anything, but I had gone on enough solo trips to know how to handle myself. I picked a spot I had been to once before, about 4 hours from my town, tucked deep into the woods near a small lake. The last time I had been there, it was peaceful and I had barely seen a soul. I packed light but brought everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, and my old hunting knife. I didn't plan on hunting, but I always carried it just in case. My plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by the lake, spend a couple of nights out there, then hike back. Nothing complicated. The drive out was easy. I turned off the main road onto an old dirt path that led to the trailhead. My truck was the only vehicle in the small parking area, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me and the wilderness. I strapped on my backpack and started walking. The trail was mostly overgrown, but I liked that. It meant fewer people used it. The hike took a couple of hours, but the weather was perfect. The sun was high, the air crisp, birds chirped from the trees, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. It was exactly what I needed. I reached the lake by mid-afternoon and found the perfect spot to set up camp. A flat clearing near the water, shaded by a few tall pines. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and set up my little cooking area. After everything was done, I sat on a log by the fire and just listened to the sounds of the woods. The wind, the occasional splash from the lake, the distant hoot of an owl. As the sun started dipping below the trees, I decided to go for a short walk along the lake's edge. The water was calm, reflecting the last light of the day. I followed the shoreline for a bit, taking in the view. That's when I saw the first sign that something was off. About 30 yards ahead, near the tree line, I spotted something on the ground. A backpack. It was old and torn, half buried under some leaves. At first, I thought maybe someone had just forgotten it, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just thrown away. It looked like it had been there for years. The fabric was rotting, and the straps were frayed. I nudged it with my boot, and the whole thing just crumbled. Something about it made me uneasy. This wasn't a spot where people camped often, and the fact that it had just been left there without anyone coming back for it was strange. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby. No tent, no fire pit, no signs that anyone had stayed there. Just that decayed backpack. I told myself it was probably just some old hiker's gear that had been left behind, and I turned back toward my camp. But as I walked, I had this nagging feeling like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Back at my camp, I got the fire going stronger and made myself some dinner. I tried to shake the feeling from earlier, but it stuck with me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times to the sound of animals moving in the brush, but that was normal. The second day, I explored further along the lake, fished for a bit, and just enjoyed the peace. That evening, as I was collecting firewood, I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, feet pressed deep into the dirt, and they led from the tree line toward the lake, then back again. My heart started pounding. I bent down and took a closer look. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, the size of a man's, and they were deep, like whoever made them was walking with purpose. I scanned the tree line, but I didn't see anything. The sun was setting, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. My gut told me to leave, but I had another night planned, and I didn't want to freak myself out over nothing. I forced myself to act normal, but my mind kept racing. Why would someone be walking around out here barefoot? And why near my camp? I kept the fire bigger that night, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. I barely slept, lying awake in my tent, listening. Every little sound made me tense up. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife tight. The footsteps stopped. Then, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just enough to make the fabric bulge inward. I stayed completely still. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. The pressure stayed for a few seconds, then it was gone. The footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand, listening. When the sun finally came up, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted. There were more footprints in the dirt, closer this time. Whoever it was had circled my camp. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, keeping my knife out the entire time. As I slung my backpack over my shoulder, I scanned the tree line one last time. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the trees, about 50 feet away. A tall, thin man, completely naked, covered in dirt. His skin was pale, almost gray. His hair was long and matted. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, without making a sound, he took a step back. And another. And then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. I didn't stick around. I hiked out of there as fast as I could, barely stopping for a break. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to that lake. I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe just some hermit living off the grid. Maybe something worse. But I still think about those footprints, the way he stood there just watching. And I wonder how many nights he had been out there, silently circling my camp, waiting. I had been camping alone for years, ever since I was a teenager. My dad used to take me out when I was a kid, and over time, I had learned to love the quiet isolation of the woods. It wasn't just about escaping the noise of the world, but something deeper. An urge to be alone, to rely on myself, to be away from everything for a while. That year, I decided to head out to a remote section of a national forest. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a patch of land far off the beaten path. I had driven miles on an old dirt road, parked where the trees grew too thick to continue, and hiked another few miles in. The place was perfect, silent except for the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. I set up my tent near a clearing, with a thick tree line on one side and a rocky outcrop on the other. It was late afternoon by the time I had my fire pit ready and my gear set up. I sat by the fire as the sun dipped behind the trees, eating a simple meal and listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The usual rustlings of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but then something changed. The sounds stopped, not all at once, but in a way that felt unnatural. The rustling faded first, then the birds. Even the wind seemed to die down. I had been in the woods long enough to know that silence was never a good sign. It meant something was nearby, something big enough that the smaller creatures had gone still. I turned, scanning the dark tree line, but I saw nothing. Still, I felt something, that eerie, unmistakable sensation of being watched. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but I did. I had a rifle, a knife, years of experience in the wilderness, so why did I feel so damn nervous? I tried to shake it off and focused on the fire, keeping my back to the trees, listening carefully. A few minutes passed, and I started to hear movement again, but something was off about it. The sounds weren't normal. They were too slow, too deliberate. I had heard deer moving through the woods plenty of times, but this wasn't a deer. It sounded like something on 2 feet, moving with a heavy, careful step. I stood up and grabbed my rifle. My first thought was a bear, maybe a person, but neither of those explanations felt right. I called out, but of course no one answered. Then I saw it, a shape just barely visible between the trees. Tall, thin, almost human but wrong. Too long in places, too stretched. It stood just at the edge of the firelight, almost blending into the shadows. My heart pounded as I tried to process what I was seeing. I had seen plenty of animals in the wild, but nothing like this. The thing didn't move for a long moment, just stood there, watching. And then, slowly, it took a step forward. The way it moved sent a chill down my spine. Its limbs jerked in an unnatural way, like it wasn't used to them, like it was trying to remember how to walk. My grip tightened on the rifle, and I aimed at it, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then it made a noise. It was the worst sound I had ever heard. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't even human. It was like something trying to copy human speech but failing, an awful, garbled attempt at making words. It sent a wave of cold dread through me. I had never been superstitious, never believed in anything beyond what I could see. But at that moment, I knew whatever I was looking at wasn't supposed to exist. I fired. The shot rang out through the trees, and the thing jerked back. But it didn't fall. It didn't run. It just stood there, and then it smiled. The firelight flickered, and I saw its face clearer now. It was wrong, too human, but not. The skin was stretched tight over its skull, the eyes too deep, the mouth too wide. The smile looked painful, like it wasn't meant to be there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear, left the tent behind, and ran. I knew the way back to my truck, knew how to navigate even in the dark. I didn't look back. The whole way, I felt it behind me, heard the heavy footsteps keeping pace, always just beyond the edge of the light. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in and sped off down the dirt road, not caring about the rough terrain, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest, never camped alone again. And sometimes late at night, I still hear that sound, the awful, broken attempt at speech, and I wonder if it followed me home. I never liked camping alone, but sometimes it felt necessary. The past few months had been rough, and I needed time to think. That's why I packed my gear and drove out to a forest in Germany, near the Bavarian border. I had camped there once before with a friend, but this time I wanted to be alone.
No distractions.
Just me, the trees, and the rain that was supposed to start later that night. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my car on a small dirt road leading into the woods. It wasn't an official campsite, just a place I had found years ago that felt secluded enough. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my supplies, and set off into the trees. The forest was dense but familiar. I followed an old hunting path that curved along a shallow stream, the ground soft and damp from previous rain. The air smelled rich, full of pine and wet soil. After hiking for nearly an hour, I reached the spot I had in mind. It was a small clearing near the base of a hill, surrounded by thick trees that acted as a natural windbreak. I set my pack down and got to work pitching my tent. The sky had turned gray by then, heavy with rain clouds that hadn't started to let loose yet. Once my tent was up, I gathered some dry wood from beneath fallen branches, careful to pick pieces that weren't too damp. I built a small fire, enough to cook dinner and keep warm. I ate in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, birds settling in for the night, the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. The loneliness felt good at first, peaceful. Then, as I finished my meal, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone quiet, completely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects, just stillness. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. It was that kind of silence that made your ears ring, the kind that felt unnatural. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes quiet, it usually means a predator is nearby. A wolf, maybe. A wild boar. I glanced at my surroundings, trying to spot movement between the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and branches swaying in the weak light of my fire. The rain started soon after. A light drizzle at first, tapping against the leaves, then gradually turning into a steady downpour. I threw the rest of my firewood onto the flames, knowing it wouldn't last long in the rain. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself inside, listening to the heavy drops against the fabric. Inside, I checked my phone. No signal. I wasn't surprised. I had expected it, but it still made me feel uneasy. I turned off the screen, laid back on my sleeping bag, and listened. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, faint but clear, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. The steps were slow, deliberate, not the random movement of an animal, but something or someone moving carefully, listening, watching. I told myself it was just paranoia. Rain has a way of distorting sounds, making them seem closer than they are. But then I heard them again, closer this time, just beyond the clearing. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated before turning it on. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my exact position. Instead, I stayed still, gripping the handle of my camping knife. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. The rain continued, hammering against my tent. I waited, heart pounding, but heard nothing else. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe it was just a deer passing through. I told myself that over and over until eventually exhaustion took over. I woke up hours later to a sound that made my blood run cold. The zipper of my tent. It was slow, careful, as if whoever was outside was trying not to wake me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The zipper went down another inch, then another. I clenched my knife in my fist, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced through every possible scenario. If it was an animal, it wouldn't be trying to open the tent like that. If it was a person, why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they using a flashlight? The zipper moved again. I couldn't wait any longer. I lunged forward, shoving my hand against the fabric and shouting as loud as I could. The second my palm hit the tent wall, I heard fast, heavy footsteps. Someone running, crashing through the undergrowth. I ripped open the zipper from the inside and shined my flashlight out into the rain. Nothing, only trees and darkness. I stepped out, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, scanning the forest. Rain pelted my face, dripping from the branches. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the wet ash. There were footprints in the mud, deep ones, leading from the edge of the clearing to my tent, but no sign of who made them. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breathing shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever it was had run off. But what if they came back? I made my decision quickly. I grabbed my backpack, shoved my most important gear inside, and left everything else behind. I wasn't about to spend another minute in that tent, waiting for whoever had been out there to return. I walked fast, almost running, using my flashlight to follow the path I had taken earlier. The rain made it difficult to see, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, forcing myself to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked to the bone. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the dirt road ahead. That's when I saw them, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching me. I didn't wait to see if they would move. I hit the gas, tires slipping in the mud, and sped down the road as fast as I could without losing control. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a gas station and sat in my car, hands shaking, heart racing. I never went back for my tent. I never went back to that forest, and I never camped alone again. I had been camping alone for years. It was something I did every few months, getting out into the woods to clear my head. I was never one for big campgrounds or designated sites. I preferred the quiet of the deep forest, places where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife. This time, I had picked a spot farther out than usual, somewhere no one else would be. I had checked the area beforehand on a map, made sure it wasn't on private land, and packed up for a 4-day trip. I was prepared, as I always was, plenty of food, extra water, my rifle, and a good sense of direction. I parked my truck on a dirt road about 2 miles from where I planned to set up camp and hiked the rest of the way in. The trees were thick, mostly pine, with only a few clearings scattered throughout. It was late autumn, the air crisp, the ground covered in fallen needles. The sun was already dropping lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent near a small creek, not too close in case of rain, but close enough that I could refill my bottles easily. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat listening to the silence around me. I didn't expect anyone to be out here. That was part of the reason I had chosen this spot. The first night was uneventful. I woke early, boiled water for coffee, and spent the day hiking, scouting the area, getting a feel for the land. I saw deer tracks, the occasional rabbit, and once, in the distance, the dark shape of a black bear moving between the trees. Paid me no mind. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I gathered more wood, built up the fire, and settled in for another quiet night. That changed on the second night. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep, but I was alert in an instant. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint light around the campsite. I listened. First, there was nothing. Then, a sound soft, almost careful, like someone stepping lightly on the forest floor. My first thought was an animal. A deer, maybe, or something smaller moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I reached for my rifle, keeping still, straining to hear. The noise had stopped. I waited for several minutes, but there was nothing but silence. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, some trick of half sleep, and lay back down, though I kept my weapon close. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled my tent, stopping just outside the fire's glow. Someone had been watching me. My stomach tightened. I was miles from anyone, or so I had thought. I scanned the tree line, searching for any movement, but saw nothing. Whoever had been there was gone now. Still, the unease stayed with me. I had camped alone more times than I could count. But this was different. I considered packing up and leaving, but decided against it. I had my rifle. I was prepared. Maybe it had been another hiker who had stumbled across my camp and left. It didn't explain why they had walked around my tent without waking me, but I tried not to dwell on that. Instead, I spent the day hunting. I hiked further out than the day before, trying to focus on the woods instead of my growing sense of unease. Every so often, I stopped to listen, checking my surroundings, making sure I was alone. The hours passed, the tension faded, and by the time I returned to camp, I had convinced myself I had overreacted. That changed on the third night. I woke up to the sound of something moving right outside my tent. Not the light, cautious steps of the night before. This was deliberate, slow, close. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding. The fire had burned down again, but there was enough light to see the shadow outside my tent. A shape, person. I sat up, gripping the gun, waiting. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there. I swallowed hard, keeping my breathing steady. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry to leave. My mind raced. Should I call out? Let them know I was armed? I decided against it. Instead, I waited. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely minutes, the figure moved. Not away, but around the tent. Slow, measured steps. I heard them near the fire pit, then by my pack, then near the creek. Then, nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light crept through the trees, I stepped outside, rifle raised. There were tracks again, clearer this time. They led from the tree line to my tent, around the campsite, then back into the woods. I followed them for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't see another soul, but I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me, playing with me. I packed up immediately. I wasn't going to spend another night out here. I hiked back to my truck faster than I ever had before, checking over my shoulder the entire way. When I reached the road, the relief was overwhelming. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on a main road, that I let myself breathe normally again. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lucky. Someone had been out there, watching me, waiting. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing: I won't be camping alone again. I never used to think much about fear. It was just something I understood in a distant way, like how a child knows fire is hot without having to touch it. But some things you only learn by experience. Some fears you don't understand until you're out there, in the middle of nowhere with the wrong kind of person watching you. It was late autumn when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had done plenty of solo trips before, but this time I wanted to push myself. I chose a spot deeper in the wilderness, far from where most hikers or campers would go. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for miles. The area was in Montana, near the Bitterroot National Forest. It was one of those places where you had to drive for hours down old Forest Service roads, then hike even further. I packed enough supplies for 4 days: food, water, extra clothes, my rifle, my knife, and a sturdy tent. My plan was to set up camp by a river I had seen on the map. I liked being near water when I camped. It gave me an easy way to stay clean, refill my bottles, and just listen to the sound of it at night. When I finally reached the river, the place was perfect. The water was clear, running fast over smooth rocks. The trees stretched high above me, their autumn colors making the forest look alive. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold earth. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, made a fire, and cooked a small meal. The first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the river and the occasional rustling in the bushes from small animals moving in the dark. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the river downstream for a few miles, just taking in the sights. It was beautiful, but I started noticing strange things. First, I found an old, rusted axe buried in a tree stump. It looked like it had been there for years, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just the rust. It was the way it was wedged into the stump, like someone had left it there in a hurry. A little further down, I found a pile of bones. They were scattered near the riverbank, bleached white from the sun. At first, I thought they were from an animal, but some of them looked too large. I told myself they had to be from a deer or an elk, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, things started feeling different. As I sat by my fire, eating, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sound or a movement, it was just a feeling, like something had shifted in the air. I kept looking around, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. Then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. My fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. The river was still running. The night was quiet, but something felt wrong. I listened. First, I heard nothing unusual. Then, just barely audible over the water, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. Animals move in bursts, quick and uneven. This was different. Someone was walking near my camp. I reached for my knife and stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath. Whoever it was, they were just outside my tent. I could hear their breathing. And then, after a long moment, they walked away. I stayed awake until morning. As soon as the sun was up, I checked the area around my tent. The ground was damp, so footprints were easy to see. There were deep boot prints leading from the tree line right up to my tent, and then back into the woods. I packed my things. I was done. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every sound made me jump. The feeling of being watched never left me. I reached my truck by late afternoon. As I threw my gear into the back, I looked down at the dirt road. There were more footprints, fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. Someone had followed me. I got in my truck and left without looking back. I still don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. I was not alone in those woods. And whoever was out there, they didn't want to be seen. I never went back. I always liked camping. It wasn't about getting away from people or even about nature itself. It was the silence, the kind you don't get in a city, where the hum of cars and distant chatter is always present. Out in the woods, away from everything, I could hear my own thoughts. That's why I kept doing it. I was in my late 30s then, still in decent shape from an active lifestyle, but not the kind of person you'd call a survivalist. I had my routines, my gear, and my spots. This time, I picked a place I had never been to before. It was a national forest in West Virginia, not too far from a small town called Fair Creek. It wasn't a popular hiking destination, which was exactly why I picked it. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off near a barely visible trailhead. No signs, no markers, just a narrow path leading into the trees. That was a good sign. It meant not many people came out here. I strapped my pack on, adjusted my boots, and headed in. The hike was rough. The trail, if you could even call it that, was overgrown, uneven, and covered in loose rocks. It felt like no one had walked it in years. That should have been a warning, but I ignored it. I wanted isolation. After about 4 miles, I found a decent clearing near a stream. It wasn't big, but it was flat enough for my tent, and I had water nearby. I set up camp, got a fire going, and ate a quick meal. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. It was perfect. Then, just as the last bit of daylight disappeared, I noticed something. The woods had gone silent. If you've spent enough time outside, you know what that means. There's always some background noise, crickets, birds, the rustling of small animals. But this was different. The silence felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I scanned the trees, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't scared yet, but I was aware. I stayed by the fire, listening. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe some animal was nearby, waiting for me to go to sleep. I stayed up longer than I planned, just watching the darkness beyond the firelight. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I crawled into my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had moved outside my tent. I held my breath and listened. A soft crunch, leaves shifting. It wasn't wind. It wasn't small. I reached for my knife. The fire outside had burned low, casting a dim, flickering glow through the thin fabric of the tent. I strained my ears, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the sound stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it had been a deer, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to convince myself of that as I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground around my tent. The dirt was soft from recent rain, easy to leave prints in. I expected to see deer tracks, maybe a raccoon's tiny hand-like prints. But what I saw was different.
Bare footprints.
Human. They weren't large, maybe a size 10, but they were deep, like whoever left them had been standing still for a long time. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. I felt my stomach turn. I was miles from the nearest road. No marked trails led here, and I hadn't seen another person since I parked my truck. I tried to stay rational. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost and stumbled across my camp. Maybe they were just as surprised to see my tent as I was to see their tracks. But why didn't they say anything? Why stand there in the dark, watching my tent? I packed up and moved deeper into the forest. I should have left. I should have hiked straight back to my truck and never looked back. But something in me refused to let this go. I wasn't going to be scared away from a camping trip. I had my knife, a hatchet, and a firearm in my pack. If someone was out here messing with me, they'd regret it. The next site I picked was harder to reach. I had to climb a steep ridge, pushing through thick underbrush. The whole time I felt watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already setting. I built my fire bigger than before, keeping my back to a rock face. At least this way, nothing could sneak up behind me. The night dragged on. I forced myself to stay awake, staring into the darkness, listening. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A single step. Not an animal. Not wind. Something heavier. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, another step. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself to relax, telling myself I was overreacting. But just as I was about to turn in, something hit my tent. Not hard, just a light tap, like a hand pressing against the fabric. I shot up, yanking my knife free. The fire cast enough light to see the shape outside. Tall, still. I lunged out, weapon ready, but there was nothing there. Just the trees. The ground where the figure had stood was undisturbed.
No prints.
No sign that anyone had ever been there. That was enough for me. I packed my gear in record time and hiked back through the night. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. Every step, I expected to hear something behind me, but the forest stayed silent. When I reached my truck at dawn, I locked the doors and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my hands stopped shaking. I never went back to that forest. I never even looked it up again. Whatever was out there, it didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to find out why. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend to get away from everything. Work, emails, traffic, the constant noise of life. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of the woods. I picked a remote camping site in the northern part of Montana, a good few miles from the nearest road, and even farther from any town. I wanted isolation. I wanted to sit by the fire with nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife in the distance. I arrived early in the afternoon, parked my truck at the edge of a dirt path, and hiked in with my pack. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had mapped everything out beforehand. The spot I chose was near a slow-moving creek, far enough away from any well-known trails that I was sure I wouldn't run into other campers. It was deep in the forest, surrounded by towering pines, with thick underbrush that made it feel like I had the whole place to myself. The perfect kind of solitude. Setting up camp was routine. I found a good clearing, laid out my tent, set up a small fire pit, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. The air was crisp but not cold, and the sun hung low behind the trees by the time I finished. I sat on a log by the fire, ate a quick meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest settling in for the night. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I stayed up for a while, enjoying the quiet, staring into the flames. It was nearly midnight when I finally decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to embers, and the only sounds left were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling in the bushes, normal forest sounds. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and let the exhaustion from the long day take over. I woke up to something moving outside my tent. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe a raccoon rummaging around for food. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I noticed something strange. The footsteps weren't the light, quick steps of an animal. They were slow, deliberate, and they were circling my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps stopped on one side of the tent. Then, after a few seconds, they shifted to the other. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles ached. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct telling me to stay still, to wait. The steps moved again, circling. Then they stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for hours, listening, gripping the knife, every nerve in my body on edge. But nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I must have drifted off. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent to look around. The ground was disturbed, the dirt scuffed up like someone had walked in circles around my camp. But there were no clear footprints, no shoe prints, no animal tracks, just disturbed dirt, like someone had tried to erase their own steps. I felt a deep unease settle in my gut. Animals don't do that. Still, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I had been half asleep, hearing things. I decided to stay for one more night. Maybe it was just a passing animal. Maybe someone was hiking nearby, and I had just been unlucky enough to have them wander too close to my camp. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, I built my fire bigger than the night before. I sat with my back against a tree, my knife close, and waited. The woods felt different. The usual nighttime sounds were there, the rustling, the wind, but something was off. The way the trees seemed too still, the way the shadows stretched out too long. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe I was letting my imagination run wild. Then, around midnight, the sound stopped.
No crickets.
No wind. Nothing. I felt my stomach twist. I strained my ears, listening for anything, any sign of movement. The fire crackled, sending flickering light dancing through the trees. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. I gripped my knife, my heart hammering. The footsteps stopped. I scanned the trees, the shadows beyond the fire's glow. Nothing, but I knew someone was there, watching. I didn't move. I just sat, waiting, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved again, this time away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going all night, sitting with my back to the tree, my knife in hand. To first light, I packed up. I didn't waste time. I broke down my tent, shoved everything into my pack, and started the hike back to my truck. The feeling of being watched never left. Every few minutes, I stopped, listening, scanning the trees. I never saw anything, never heard anything, but the feeling was there. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back and got in, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the tree line one last time, and that's when I saw him, a figure, just standing there, half hidden behind the trees. Too far away to make out details, but close enough that I knew he had been watching me the whole time. I didn't wait. I didn't stop. I drove until I was back on the main road, until I was miles away from that forest. I never went back, and I never camp alone anymore. I was never the type to get scared easily. I had been hunting, fishing, and camping alone since I was a teenager, spending nights in the deep woods without a second thought. I had always found peace in the wilderness. Just me, the trees, the sound of the wind, and the distant howls of coyotes. But that trip changed everything. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the remote forests of northern Montana. I had been working long hours and needed a break from people, noise, and the constant stress of everyday life. I packed my gear, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, rifle, knife, and enough food for a few days, and drove out early in the morning. The drive was long, stretching over 4 hours into the mountains, but I enjoyed the solitude. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the open road. I reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon, parked my truck, and started the hike toward my campsite. It was about 5 miles in, deep enough that I wouldn't run into any casual hikers, but not so far that I'd be in real trouble if something went wrong. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were my boots crunching against the dirt trail and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. By the time I reached my spot, the sun was beginning to dip below the treeline. I set up my tent near a small clearing, not far from a quiet stream. The ground was level, the trees provided good cover, and there were no signs of other campers. Perfect. I gathered some firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal of beans and beef jerky. As the darkness settled in, I leaned back against a log, staring up at the stars. Everything felt right, but then the feeling changed. It was subtle at first, just an unease that crept in at the edges of my mind. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on exhaustion or the simple paranoia of being alone in the woods. But the longer I sat there, the stronger it became. It wasn't fear, at least not yet. It was the feeling of being watched. I scanned the tree line, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. Nothing moved. No animals, no shifting branches, no glowing eyes reflecting back at me. Just the stillness of the night. I convinced myself I was imagining things, threw a few more logs on the fire, and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of the wind against the leaves, every snap of a twig made my body tense. I lay there, staring up at the nylon ceiling of my tent, gripping the handle of my knife just in case. Hours passed. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible. A faint crunching in the distance, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Crunch, then silence. I slowly reached for my rifle, careful not to make a sound. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest glow. The woods beyond were pitch black. I waited. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something harmless. But I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 feet from my campsite, the ground had been disturbed. The leaves and dirt had been shifted, almost like someone had been standing there for a long time, pacing in place. No footprints, just an area where the forest floor had been unsettled. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a bear had wandered close, sniffing around. Maybe I had done it myself and just didn't remember. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I spent the day hiking and hunting, trying to shake off the unease. The forest was quiet, the air cool and fresh. I spotted a few deer, but they were too far for a clean shot. I found tracks, probably from a wolf, but they looked old. By the time I got back to camp, I had almost convinced myself that last night had been all in my head. Almost. That night, the feeling returned. Stronger this time. I kept the fire going as long as I could, adding logs until I ran low on wood. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that made my imagination run wild. Every movement of the trees looked like something creeping toward me. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Then I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, scanning the darkness. My heart pounded. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. My finger rested on the trigger. Nothing. Minutes passed. My eyes strained against the dark. Still nothing. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the fire's reach. Tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette against the trees. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. My mind raced. Was it a lost hiker? A ranger? Someone else camping nearby? But deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They were watching me. I raised my rifle. My voice caught in my throat, but I forced out a warning. Something low and firm. The figure didn't react, just stood there. Then, slowly, it stepped backward into the trees. Gone. I didn't sleep. To first light, I packed up. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't going to risk it. Something was out there, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out what they wanted. I moved fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. The trail seemed longer than before, every turn stretching endlessly. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving. Then I saw it. A second campsite, empty. The fire pit was cold. The tent flattened, gear scattered. It looked abandoned. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Blood. Not a lot, but enough. A smear on the tent fabric. Dark stains on the dirt. I didn't stop. I didn't call out. I just kept moving. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. I threw my gear into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town, found a small diner, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I never went back to that spot. I never reported it. Some things you don't want to know the answers to. Some things you just walk away from. I never liked the woods at night. Something about them always felt wrong. Like the trees leaned in just a little too close, the air held just a little too still, and the silence wasn't really silence at all. But when my cousin Jake suggested a weekend trip to an old, abandoned campsite he had found years ago, I agreed without thinking too much about it. It was the summer of 2013, and we had both been looking for an excuse to get away. We were in our late 20s then, old enough to know better, young enough to ignore that fact. Jake had always been the more adventurous one. He was the type who loved wandering into places where no one else had been for years. I was more cautious, but I trusted him. The place was somewhere deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from any main roads, past endless stretches of trees and hills. He had stumbled across it once while hunting years ago, an old campsite long forgotten, with decaying wooden cabins and rusted-out fire pits. He had been obsessed with going back ever since. I didn't ask why. Some people are drawn to strange things, and Jake was one of them. We left early in the morning, driving for hours down long, empty roads until the pavement disappeared and turned into a dirt path full of potholes. The forest was thick here, the trees towering on either side, cutting off the sky in places. It was the kind of road where you didn't see other cars. The kind of place where, if something happened, you were well and truly alone. After what felt like an eternity of bouncing along the rough road, Jake pulled off near a barely visible trailhead. There was no sign, no indication that anyone had ever been here. He grinned, excited. I tried to shake off the unease settling in my gut. We packed light, just the essentials. We weren't planning to stay long, just one night. Jake led the way, cutting through the trees like he had been here 1,000 times before. The hike wasn't easy. The trail was overgrown, barely a trail at all, just patches of flattened earth winding through the forest. The deeper we went, the quieter everything got. And then we saw it. The campsite was exactly as Jake had described, old, empty, forgotten. There were a handful of wooden cabins, their walls warped and broken, their windows either shattered or missing. The fire pits were filled with years of dirt and ash. There were no signs of people, no graffiti, no beer cans, no footprints in the mud. Just nature slowly reclaiming what had been abandoned. Felt wrong. Jake, of course, was thrilled. He started exploring immediately, pushing open cabin doors, stepping inside, kicking at the debris on the floor. I stayed outside, scanning the area, listening. The silence here was different. I couldn't hear birds or insects. No wind rustled the trees. It was just still. "Let's set up here," Jake said, coming back out of one of the cabins. He dropped his pack on the ground and stretched. "This place is perfect." I hesitated but nodded. There was no point in arguing. We set up camp near the biggest cabin. We could have slept inside, but neither of us wanted to. The smell of rot and mold was too strong. Instead, we laid out our sleeping bags just outside the doorway, built a fire in one of the old pits, and tried to settle in. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, but the air was still warm. Jake was asleep, breathing heavy beside me. The trees loomed overhead, their branches cutting jagged shapes against the dark sky. And then I heard it, something moving, not an animal, not the rustling of leaves or the snapping of twigs beneath small feet. Something heavier, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It came from the trees behind the cabins, a soft shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet through the undergrowth. I turned my head slowly, eyes straining in the darkness. Nothing, but the sound was still there. I wanted to wake Jake, but something stopped me. A deep, gut-level instinct told me to stay still, to listen, to wait. And then it stopped, just like that. The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Jake about what I had heard. He laughed it off, said I was just spooking myself. "Old places make weird noises," he said. "Probably just a deer." But I knew what I had heard. Still, I let it go. We spent the day exploring the rest of the site. Most of the cabins were empty. Just rotting wood, rusted nails, the occasional piece of old furniture. But the last cabin we checked was different. The door was closed, All the others had been hanging open, but this one was shut tight. Jake pushed it open with his boot, and the second we stepped inside, I knew we had made a mistake. There were things in here, not much, but enough. A sleeping bag, old and torn, shoved into the corner. A rusted-out lantern. A pile of bones near the fireplace. Not human, but stripped clean. Someone had been here. Recently. Jake knelt down, poking at the sleeping bag. Probably just some squatter, he muttered. I didn't respond, because something caught my eye. Something scratched into the wood near the door. Faint, almost gone, but still there. Levi swallowed hard. We should go, I said. Jake stood, dusting off his hands. Relax, he said. It's just an old camp. Whoever was here is long gone. But I wasn't so sure. That night I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the sky, listening, waiting. And then it started again. The same sound. Slow, dragging, closer this time. I reached out, shaking Jake awake. He groaned, sat up, and then he heard it too. We didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. The footsteps circled the campsite, moving between the cabins. Slow, watching, then a creak. The sound of a door swinging open. The last cabin, the one with the sleeping bag. Jake grabbed his flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the trees, landing on the cabin door. It was open now, swinging slightly in the breeze. And there was something standing just inside. A shape, person, tall, thin, motionless, watching us. Jake swore, scrambling for his pack. I didn't move, couldn't. Then the figure stepped forward. That broke the spell. We ran. We didn't pack, didn't look back, just ran. All the way back to the truck, through the dark, through the trees, hearing footsteps behind us the whole way. We didn't stop until we were inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. And when we finally looked back, the figure was standing at the tree line, watching, still. We never went back. We never spoke about it. And I still don't know what we saw. But I do know this, that campsite wasn't abandoned. I didn't think much about the drive out. It was supposed to be a weekend away. Just me, my rifle, and a stretch of untouched wilderness. That's what I wanted. Some quiet, some space to clear my head. I had done these kinds of trips before, nothing complicated. Just pack up my gear, head to a remote spot, and let the world fade away for a while. I had found the location online. A guy on a hunting forum mentioned an old logging road leading to a great spot deep in the mountains, far away from the crowds. He had been there years ago and said there was a small abandoned woodsman's cabin nearby. Said it was good for shelter if the weather turned. That was all I needed to hear. I packed light, just enough food for a few days, my sleeping bag, and enough ammo to last. The drive out was long. The roads were rough, the kind that make you grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Trees pressed in from both sides, and I lost cell service about an hour before I reached the turnoff. The logging road was almost invisible, just a break in the trees and a narrow, rutted trail leading into the forest. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have missed it completely. I bumped along the path for what felt like forever, my truck groaning over rocks and fallen branches. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No sounds of distant highways, no hum of civilization. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere out in the woods. I found a clearing big enough to park and set up camp. I didn't go looking for the cabin right away. I figured I'd check it out later if I needed it. I got a fire going, set up my tent, and ate a quick meal before the light started to fade. That first night, nothing happened. I listened to the sounds of the woods as I drifted off. The usual things: owls calling in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional crack of a twig somewhere in the dark. It was peaceful in a way only the deep woods can be. I woke up early, grabbed my rifle and set out to hunt. The forest was thick, the kind of place where you could walk 10 feet off the trail and disappear completely. I moved slow, taking my time, scanning the trees for any movement. Hours passed. I didn't see much, just a few tracks here and there, some old deer scat, but no fresh signs. At some point, I realized I had wandered farther than I meant to. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but I wasn't sure how far I had gone. I turned back and tried to retrace my steps. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It was old. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging in places. One window was broken, the other covered in grime. The door was slightly open, just enough to see darkness inside. I don't know why, but I felt uneasy looking at it. Something about the way it sat there, hidden among the trees, made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just an old building, nothing more. Maybe an old hunting cabin or a trapper's shack from years ago. I stepped up onto the porch, the wood creaking under my boots, pushed the door open a little more. The inside was just as I expected. Dust, scattered debris, a broken chair in the corner, an old cot against the far wall, the mattress long gone, a rusted wood stove, and something else. Boot prints in the dust. Not old ones either. I felt my stomach tighten. They weren't mine, and they weren't covered in dust like everything else. Someone had been here, recently. I stood there for a long moment listening. Nothing, just the trees outside, the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I backed out, careful not to make a sound. I didn't run, but I moved fast. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I sat by the fire, my rifle close, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe some other hunter had found the cabin too. Maybe they had moved on. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps. Not an animal, something slower, deliberate. I gripped my rifle and sat there, staring into the dark, but nothing happened. The next morning, I decided to leave early. The hunting was bad anyway. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and threw everything into the truck. When I turned onto the logging road, I felt a sense of relief. Then I saw the footprints, in the dirt, leading from the woods to my camp. They hadn't been there before. They weren't mine, and they came right up to my tent. I stared at them, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Whoever it was had been watching me, standing just outside my tent in the middle of the night. I didn't stay to think about it. I drove, fast. The truck bounced over rocks and ruts, the trees blurring past. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, my hands still shaking. I never went back, never tried to figure out who it was or why they were out there. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some doors should never be opened. I've always been comfortable in the woods, grew up in them, spent more time out there than in town. I knew how to move through the trees without making a sound, how to track a deer for miles, how to listen for things most people never even notice. The woods were a second home to me, but that trip made me rethink everything I thought I knew. It was late October, a perfect time for hunting. The air was cold but not unbearable. The leaves had turned crisp and golden, and most of the summer tourists had long gone. I had planned the trip for weeks. A solo hunting trip deep in the mountains of western Montana, a place I'd hunted before but never gone this far into. It was remote, untouched land, hours from the nearest town, the kind of place where you didn't see another soul for days. That was what I wanted. I packed light but smart. My rifle, my knife, enough food for a week, my tent, sleeping bag, and the usual survival gear. I knew how to live off the land if I needed to, and I wasn't worried about running out of supplies. The plan was simple. Hike in about 10 miles, set up a base camp near a small river I'd marked on my map, and hunt in the surrounding area for elk. If I got lucky, I'd haul the meat back in sections over a few trips. The hike in was harder than I expected. The terrain was steep, and the underbrush was thicker than I remembered. It took me longer to reach my planned campsite than I had hoped, but when I got there, it was perfect. A flat clearing surrounded by tall pines, with the river just a short walk away. No signs of anyone else having been there. That was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The temperature dropped fast, and by the time I had a fire going, I could see my breath in the air. I cooked some beans and venison jerky over the fire, ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the woods around me. The wind rustling the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch as some animal moved through the darkness. I slept light, as I always did when I was alone in the woods. Every small noise woke me up, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the usual sounds of the wild. The next morning, I packed a small day bag with food, water, and extra ammunition and set out to hunt. I moved slowly, stepping carefully, stopping often to listen. There were fresh elk tracks, a good sign. I followed them for hours, through thick brush, over rocky hills, deeper into the wilderness. That was when I first got the feeling. At first, it was subtle, just a sense that something was off. The woods felt wrong, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and squirrels moving through the trees were gone. Even the wind had died down. It was just me and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I shook it off, probably just my imagination. When you spend enough time alone in the wild, your mind plays tricks on you. I kept going. A few hours later, I spotted the elk, a big bull, standing in a clearing about 100 yards ahead. I crouched low, raising my rifle, taking my time to line up the shot. My finger tightened on the trigger. Then the elk's head snapped up. Its ears twitched, its eyes wide with fear. Before I could react, it bolted. Not running from me, but from something else. Something behind me. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there, just trees. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering. I told myself it was a bear, maybe a wolf, but I hadn't seen any tracks, and whatever it was, it had scared that elk bad. I decided to head back to camp. The hunt could wait. The walk back felt longer. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the trees. Every rustling branch, every shifting shadow put me on edge. I didn't like it. By the time I got back, the sun was already getting low. I started a fire, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I forced myself to eat, but every bite felt like a chore. That night, I barely slept. Something was out there. I could hear it. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving just beyond the firelight. Slow, careful. Not an animal. Animals don't move like that. I stayed completely still in my sleeping bag, listening. My rifle was within reach. I gripped it tight, finger resting on the trigger. The footsteps circled the camp. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the fire had burned down to embers. My first thought was that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind, the trees, my mind playing tricks on me. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't from an animal. Bare feet, human, but the stride was off, the prints too far apart, as if whoever made them had been moving in an unnatural way. I packed my gear fast. The hunt was over. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back was the longest of my life. Every step, I expected to hear those footsteps behind me, to see something moving through the trees. I never did, but the feeling never left. I made it back to my truck just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I caught movement in the rearview mirror. Something standing at the tree line, too far to see clearly, but I knew it was watching me. I didn't wait. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I still hunt, still camp, but never alone. Not anymore. I was never the kind of person who scared easily. I had spent most of my life camping, hiking, and hunting in the Australian outback, where the land was harsh, the weather unforgiving, and danger was always around the corner. The wilderness could be cruel, but it had never truly terrified me before. That changed on a trip I took in late November, deep in the bush, miles away from civilization. It started as an ordinary camping trip. I had planned a solo getaway for a few days, packing my truck with enough supplies to last a week. The location I chose was a remote area west of Alice Springs, a place I had only been to once before. It was quiet, untouched, and far from any tourist trails. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, fresh air, and nothing but the sound of nature around me. The drive out took longer than expected. The dirt roads were rough, covered in deep ruts from recent rain, and I had to take my time navigating through them. The sun was setting by the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp. I parked my truck near a few tall eucalyptus trees, unpacked my gear, and got to work. Within an hour, my tent was up, the fire was going, and I had a meal cooking in a small pan over the flames. The night was peaceful. The sky was clear, stars stretched endlessly above me, and a cool breeze rustled through the dry grass. I sat by the fire, sipping a warm cup of tea, enjoying the silence. There was no sound of traffic, no voices, no distant hum of a town, just the occasional chirp of insects and the rustling of leaves. It was exactly what I had wanted. I turned in for the night, crawling into my sleeping bag and shutting my eyes. I drifted off quickly, exhausted from the long drive. The first thing that woke me was the smell. It was faint at first, just a whisper of something off, a mix of damp earth and something else, something foul. I ignored it, rolling over in my sleeping bag, but it lingered, thick, rotting. It was enough to pull me from my half-asleep state. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the drowsiness. The tent was dark, but I could hear something outside, a low rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. It was probably just an animal, maybe a kangaroo or a wild dog. I had seen plenty of them on my trips. Still, the smell nagged at me. It was stronger now, almost unbearable, like meat left out in the sun for days. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night was still. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint light over the campsite. I swept the flashlight beam across the area, scanning the trees, the bushes, the ground. Nothing, but the smell was everywhere. Thick, cloying, making my stomach churn. I walked away from the tent, following my nose, trying to locate the source. The beam of my flashlight danced across the ground, illuminating patches of dry grass, scattered twigs, and dirt. Then, about 20 meters from my camp, I saw it, a shape in the grass. At first, I thought it was an animal carcass, maybe something a dingo had dragged out here. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was a person, lying face down, arms stretched out in front of them. The body was bloated, the skin darkened from decomposition. I could see patches of clothing, torn and stained, clinging to the corpse. The The smell was overwhelming, making my eyes water. I swallowed hard, stepping back, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to run, to get in my truck and drive as far away as possible. But I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints, no tracks leading to or from the body. Just the corpse lying there, as if it had been dropped in the middle of nowhere. I turned and walked briskly back to my camp, trying to control my breathing. My mind was racing. How had this person ended up here? How long had they been dead? Had someone dumped them? Was whoever did this still nearby? The thought made my skin crawl. I had spent years in the bush, but I had never come across anything like this. I needed to call the police, but I had no reception out here. My phone was useless. I would have to drive back to the nearest town at least 2 hours away. I grabbed my keys and turned toward my truck. Then I stopped. Something had changed. The fire, which had been little more than embers moments ago, was now smoldering, as if someone had stirred it. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I wasn't alone. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in front of me. Then, in the beam of my headlights, I saw them. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond my campsite. They were still watching. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they had been there the whole time. Watching me, I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires kicking up dirt as I spun around. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove, pushing the truck as fast as it would go down the rough, uneven roads. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. By the time I made it to town and reported what I had found, it was nearly morning. The police took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me at first. Not until they went out there and saw the body themselves. They never found the person who had been watching me. The body belonged to a man in his late 30s. No ID, no missing person report that matched his description. No explanation for how he had ended up there. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, but I don't go as deep into the bush anymore. I don't stray too far from other people. And every time I smell something rotting in the air, I remember that night. And I wonder if whoever was watching me is still out there. It was late October, and the rain hadn't stopped for hours. The steady drumming against my tent was the only sound in the middle of nowhere, apart from the occasional wind gusts rattling the trees. I had set up camp deep in the woods, miles away from any town or road, in a place that was supposed to be untouched, quiet, and peaceful. First, it had been. The hike in was long and exhausting, but I'd wanted solitude, and this spot had seemed perfect. I had planned for everything. Plenty of food, warm clothes, a good sleeping bag, even a small tarp over my tent to keep some of the rain off. I was prepared for a normal, quiet night alone. But something wasn't right. I had felt it before I even pitched my tent. It was that strange, uneasy feeling that crawls up the back of your neck, the one you try to shake off but can't. At first, I told myself it was just the isolation. I wasn't used to being this far from civilization, with no reception, no lights, no sounds of passing cars in the distance. Just the wind, the rain, and the trees. Still, the feeling lingered. As the night stretched on, the rain only grew heavier. I stayed in my tent, dry and warm, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But every now and then, I would hear something besides the rain and wind, a sound that was out of place. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was a branch falling, a deer moving through the underbrush, normal things I had heard before. But then there was a distinct sound, a footstep. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was deliberate, slow, and close. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the rain. My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought. Then I heard it again. Closer. A cold wave of dread washed over me. My tent was zipped shut, the rain pounding so hard on the tarp that I couldn't see anything outside. But I knew something was out there. I stayed still. The air in my tent felt suffocating, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. Then the sound moved. Whatever it wasn't stumbling around randomly. It was circling my tent. I swallowed hard. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was too controlled, too precise. I forced myself to stay calm. I had my knife, my bear spray. If it was an animal, it would leave. If it was a person, I didn't want to think about that. The sound stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, just the wind and the rain. I started to think that maybe whatever it was had gone. Maybe it was just passing through. Then the tent fabric moved. Not much, just a slight press, as if someone or something had placed a hand against it. I stopped breathing. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. But I didn't hear anything else. No more footsteps, no more movement. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The rain had lessened, but the ground was still wet, muddy. I looked around, and then I saw them. Footprints. They were human. They circled my tent once before leading off into the trees. I followed them for a short distance, my stomach twisting. They didn't lead back toward a road or a trail. They led deeper into the woods. And then they just stopped. No sign of where the person had gone. No sign of anything at all. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about resting. I just wanted to get out. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. I don't know who was out there with me that night, and I don't ever want to find out. It had been years since I last went camping. Life got in the way, work, responsibilities, routines that seemed endless. But when my ex-husband, Daniel, reached out, suggesting we take a trip to the woods, I hesitated. It wasn't that we had ended on bad terms. If anything, our divorce had been quiet, just two people growing apart. We stayed in touch, mostly out of habit, and while things weren't perfect between us, we never outright hated each other. He was still a cop, still carrying that same steady, methodical nature, and I was still trying to find my footing after our split. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was just needing a break from the monotony of my life. He picked a spot he had heard about from another officer. Deep in the woods, away from any major trails. Supposedly, it was quiet, untouched. A place where you wouldn't hear cars, or even planes overhead. Just silence and the occasional rustling of the trees. We drove out early in the morning, heading north through winding roads that cut through thick forest. The car ride was mostly quiet. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur together, and let myself slip into old memories. I had forgotten how much I used to love this. Packing up, leaving the world behind, letting nature wrap around me like a heavy blanket. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. The farther we went, the less it felt like a normal camping trip. There were no other cars, no signs marking trails or campgrounds. Just dense, unbroken wilderness. Daniel finally pulled the truck over on a narrow dirt path that barely looked used. He killed the engine, exhaled through his nose, and grabbed his backpack. "This is it," he muttered, more to himself than to me. We hiked for nearly an hour, following an old deer path through the woods. The farther we went, the thicker the trees became. The sun barely broke through, casting the forest floor in a dim, shifting light. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and wet earth. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. No distant hum of highways, no planes overhead. Even the birds seemed muted, their calls brief and distant. We found a clearing nestled between a cluster of towering pines. It was perfect, flat, quiet, surrounded by thick trees that gave us a sense of isolation. We set up camp quickly, our old routine coming back easily. Tent first, then firewood, then food. It felt almost natural, like we had never stopped doing this together. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped. The fire crackled, sending flickering light against the trunks. We ate in silence, listening to the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Something about the air felt heavy, though. I couldn't place it, but there was something off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling in my gut, a strange awareness prickling at the back of my mind. Daniel must have felt it too. He kept glancing up from the fire, his eyes sweeping the tree line. He had always been observant, years on the force had sharpened that instinct, but this was different. He wasn't just being cautious. He was looking for something. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. The woods had grown eerily silent. No wind, no insects, just thick, pressing stillness. Then I heard it, a single twig snapping, not far, maybe 20, 30 feet into the trees. Daniel heard it too. His posture shifted, one hand resting on the knife strapped to his belt. We both sat still, listening. Nothing. A long silence stretched between us. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. Probably an animal, a deer, a fox, something small, harmless. Another snap, closer this time. Daniel stood slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate. He tilted his head, listening. I did the same, my ears straining against the silence. Nothing. A long, empty moment passed, and then footsteps. Slow, measured. Not an animal. Someone was walking through the woods, just out of sight. Daniel moved, stepping away from the firelight, his hand slipping to the holster at his hip. His fingers curled around the grip of his gun, steady, controlled. I stayed frozen, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. A thick, suffocating quiet that pressed against my ears. I strained my eyes, searching the darkness between the trees, but I saw nothing. Minutes passed, still nothing. Then Daniel relaxed just a fraction. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like he had let his nerves get the best of him. Probably just a deer, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, but my stomach remained tight. I forced myself to breathe, to ignore the way my skin prickled with unease. We let the fire die down, crawling into the tent. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the quiet, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened my eyes, it was pitch black. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, dying glow. I wasn't sure what woke me at first. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine, not Daniel's, close, just outside the tent. I went still, every muscle locking in place. Slow, deliberate breaths, deep, controlled, like someone standing just outside, waiting. My heart pounded against my ribs. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence. I waited, every second stretching unbearably long. Then a soft scrape, something against the fabric of the tent. A hand. I stopped breathing entirely. My skin burned with the effort to stay still. The pressure lifted. Then footsteps, slow, moving away. I lay frozen until the first hint of dawn bled through the trees. Daniel stirred beside me, shifting. I could tell the moment he fully woke up. His body tensed, that cop instinct kicking in immediately. He listened for a second, then slowly unzipped the tent. The campsite was undisturbed. The fire had burned out completely, but nothing was out of place. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. Daniel scanned the tree line, his jaw tight. His hand hovered near his hip, his posture stiff. "We're leaving," he said, voice low. I didn't argue. We packed in silence, moving quickly. The air felt heavier than before, thick with something I couldn't name. As we hiked back to the truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder, my stomach twisting. Nothing followed us, but somehow I knew someone had been there, watching, waiting, and whoever it was, they had been standing just inches away from me in the dark. It was early September when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had a week off work, and I wanted some time alone. I'd been camping plenty of times before, usually with friends or family, but this time I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to be alone in the wilderness, far away from everything. I picked a spot deep in the forests of northern Idaho, far from any towns or tourist sites. It was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived, plus another hour down dirt roads until I reached a remote trailhead. I had studied the area on maps and planned to hike about 10 miles in before setting up camp near a small lake. There wouldn't be anyone else around, not this far out. That was the whole point. The weather was perfect for camping. The forecast showed mild temperatures during the day and cooler nights. I packed enough food for 5 days, along with my tent, sleeping bag, and all the essentials. I had my hunting knife, a small hatchet, and a bear spray canister in case of wildlife. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, but once I turned off the main highway onto the dirt road, it felt like I was entering a different world. The road was rough, full of potholes, and barely wide enough for my truck in some spots. The trees on either side grew so thick that they blocked most of the sunlight. It felt isolated, peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. When I reached the trailhead, there were no other vehicles in sight. That wasn't surprising. This wasn't a well-traveled area. I got out, stretched my legs, and took a moment to appreciate the quiet. No traffic noise, no people, just the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I shouldered my backpack and started hiking. The trail was overgrown, clearly not used often. Some sections were hard to follow, but I had my GPS and a paper map just in case. As I moved deeper into the woods, the silence became more pronounced. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, but beautiful, clear water reflecting the surrounding pine trees. There was a small clearing on the eastern shore that looked like a good spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up my cooking area. By the time the sun started setting, I had a small fire going. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. As darkness settled in, the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in my jacket and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. I felt completely alone. That night, I slept better than I expected. I woke up once when I thought I heard something outside the tent, but after listening for a minute, I decided it was just the wind or a small animal and went back to sleep. The second day was uneventful. I explored the area around the lake, fished for a while, and just relaxed. I didn't see any signs of other people, no footprints, no campsites, nothing. It was that night when things started feeling off. I was sitting by the fire again, just watching the flames and enjoying the quiet, when I got that strange feeling, like I was being watched. It came out of nowhere. a sudden awareness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight but saw nothing. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone out here, and my brain was overreacting to the isolation. I forced myself to relax, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. I zipped it up tight and lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. At some point during the night, I woke up again. This time, I was sure I'd heard something. A noise, faint but distinct. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I recognized. It was almost like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My heart was pounding. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, barely breathing, waiting to hear it again. But there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. I must have dreamed it. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone or anything had been near my tent. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I spent most of the day trying to shake it off. I told myself it was just paranoia, but as the sun started to set, the uneasiness grew stronger. I almost considered packing up and hiking back to my truck, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin the trip. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I ate a cold meal and got into my tent early. I lay there in the darkness, listening. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it. A sound. Closer this time. Footsteps. Not an animal. Definitely not an animal. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something was walking just outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My knife was within reach, and I gripped it tightly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, just outside the thin fabric of my tent, I heard breathing. Slow, deep. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body locked in fear. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then the breathing stopped. I didn't hear footsteps moving away. Nothing. Just silence. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally forced myself to move. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peered out. The moon was bright, casting shadows through the trees. But there was nothing there. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been near my tent. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started hiking back. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to rest. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole way back, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached my truck, I was exhausted. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to process what had happened. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something. In the dirt next to my truck. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the woods to the driver's side door. And then they stopped. Whoever or whatever had been out there had followed me, had watched me, and then, just before I reached my truck, they had disappeared. I didn't waste another second. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back since, and I never will. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the dense forests of southern France. The air had cooled just enough to make the nights crisp, but the days were still warm enough to enjoy being outside. I had camped before, mostly in the forests of Germany and once in the Scottish Highlands, but France had a different feel to it. Older, untouched in ways that made the trees seem heavier, their branches tangled like they had been growing together for centuries. I had parked my car off a dirt road nearly 30 kilometers from the nearest village, loading my pack with enough supplies to last a few days. My plan was simple: hike into the forest, set up camp near a river I had marked on my map, and spend a few days disconnected from the world. I wasn't afraid of the wilderness. I had prepared well, brought extra food, water filtration, and even a GPS in case I lost my bearings. The first day passed uneventfully. The hike was beautiful. Tall pines and ancient oaks, the air thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. I found the river without trouble and set up camp a little uphill from the bank. The sound of running water was always comforting. It drowned out the smaller noises of the woods, the rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig that might otherwise put me on edge. I spent the evening cooking over a small fire, eating dried meat and rice, and staring up at the darkening sky. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet I had come out here for. By the time I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I felt completely at ease. The first strange thing happened that night. I woke up sometime after midnight. The fire had burned down to embers, just enough glow to see the outlines of the trees. The river murmured in the background, steady, unchanged, but something was different. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the kind made by a small animal, these were heavier, deliberate. They crunched through the undergrowth somewhere beyond my tent, slow and steady. I held my breath, waiting to hear if they would move closer. They stopped. I waited, listening. My heart pounded in my ears. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a deer passing through, startled by the remnants of my fire. I forced myself to relax, breathing deeply until sleep came again. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and patches of damp earth, but I didn't see any clear tracks. I reasoned that whatever had been there must have moved on. Still, I felt uneasy. The silence of the forest, which had been comforting the day before, now felt heavier. I spent the day hiking along the river, fishing, and trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. By the time I returned to camp in the late afternoon, I had almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. I rebuilt my fire, cooked a meal, and forced myself to relax. That night, the noises started again. I woke up just like before, with no idea why at first. Then I heard it, closer this time, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling my camp. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened. The steps would start, then stop. Start, then stop. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a random wanderer. Something was out there, just beyond the fire's dying light, watching. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, my pulse hammering in my skull. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever or whatever it was to show themselves, but instinct told me not to. Minutes passed, then an hour. The steps never came closer. Eventually, they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around my camp. Human-like, but wrong. The prints were elongated, the toes too long, the arch too deep. Something had been standing there, watching. I should have packed up right then and there. I should have hiked back to my car and left. But I didn't. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overreacting. I had spent enough time in the wild to know that fear could make a man see things that weren't real. I stayed. That night, I kept the fire going as long as I could, feeding it dry wood until the flames were high. I sat by it, knife in my lap, listening. The sounds started earlier this time. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Closer. Then I saw it. A shape at the edge of the firelight. Tall. Too tall. It stood just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Its head was wrong, elongated, its limbs slightly too long. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't make out its face. I didn't move. It didn't move. The fire crackled. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my knife in my hand until the first light of dawn touched the trees. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and left. I hiked fast, barely stopping for water, ignoring the burning in my legs. The whole time I felt watched. The trees felt too quiet, the air too heavy. I reached my car just before noon, tossing my gear into the back seat, hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something standing at the treeline, watching, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached the next town, checked into a small hotel, locked the door, and sat awake the entire night. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain I can hear footsteps just beyond the edge of the light.